another person's story. And so my contribution to this was a new story of the calculus. And this was published in 2007, but of course there was a whole lot of work done before that. That calculus, are you able to see this?
Yes, we are able to see it.
Okay, thank you for that confirmation. Basically, that calculus was invented in India, 5th to 14th century, with a different epistemology, right? That's important, that it is not the kind of epistemology which is given to it in standard university texts. I won't go into that, but I'm just pointing that out. Okay, so this has a different epistemology, and it was stolen by Cochin-based Jesuits in the 16th century and falsely attributed to Newton and Leibniz. I will give a slide on Leibniz subsequently. But the point is that neither of them fully understood the calculus and its infinite series. So there is an article that I have recently written on Marx and mathematics, illustrating my epistemic test and explaining why Newton did not understand the calculus, and of course Leibniz did not understand the series that's attributed to him. So then the realization came that a new story is not enough. You also need a new way to teach. And so I started teaching courses on decolonized calculus without limits. Started off in India. So this was the first course in Sarnath. Like the Buddha, I started my journey there. Then it was in Malaysia. And so this was published long back in 2011. This report on how I was teaching calculus to students there. Then in Iran, we had this for social scientists in India, and also for engineering students much more recently. So it has been tried out. The teaching has been tried out. But the point is, this was very strongly opposed by formal mathematicians and the story of Euclid. So I have been contesting this for quite some time. There was this article long ago on Goodbye Euclid. I gave a talk on it in University Science Malaysia, and there's a video of that talk also available, Goodbye Euclid, which is there on my site. Now I think I will skip this, but it's taking a lot of time to load. Yeah, so this is the talk, and the Malaysian Deputy Minister for Education chaired the meeting. So this was quite interesting, but then it sort of petered out. But 10 years ago, I identified that we never examined the false history and bad philosophy of science that we have received, and that is the root cause of continued post-colonial Western academic hegemony. So this was my book that I wrote. There was a meeting in Iran on that. And after that, we organized a week-long meeting to teach the syllabus to devise a new curriculum for history and philosophy of science. And I taught it. Somebody's mic is on. So I taught this new decolonized course. As you can see, there were a lot of students, and they did practical things like measuring the radius of the Earth and so on, which are very old things. And there is also a video of students' reactions, if you want to see it. This is taking a lot of time to load. But there is a video of it. It's just a 2-minute video, but I can't show it to you right now. You can check all these out. I'll put up the presentation. Now, 5 years ago, during the Rhodes Must Fall agitation, I visited Pretoria, the University of South Africa, and talked on my experiences with decolonizing mathematics, how to teach calculus differently, and so on. Now, this talk seems to have frightened some white racists. And one of them, she wrote that blacks and women are bad at math, and that to in quotes, decolonize math, one must teach them to think like the dead white men like Euclid, who supposedly created the subject of mathematics, and I think lost the power here. Just give me a moment. I hope to recover. Yeah. So I wrote on that, and I wrote an article that Europeans, including early Greeks, were backward even in basic arithmetic until the 16th century. And they could not have invented math, and that Euclid was anyway a black woman, as shown in the cover of my 2012 book, Euclid and Jesus. So this is the book. And I'm making this, I put this forward very seriously, this hypothesis, and I'm willing to defend it if somebody wants to discuss it. Anyway, this was published in the Conversation. It went viral. It was reproduced worldwide, and then it was censored worldwide. It was censored. Now the question is, why was it censored? You can read this article. It's available online on Science 2.0. Just Google, was Euclid a black woman? Point is, why was it censored? See, given that it had gone viral, why wasn't there a rebuttal? And there is an obvious reason for that. That the academic issue of the lack of evidence for Euclid was settled way back in 2002, when David Fowler, the leading Western authority on the history of Greek mathematics, admitted in response to a question about me that we know nothing about Euclid. So somebody asked, what is known about Euclid? He said, nothing. So nothing is known. But it's not only that nothing is known, there is plenty of counter evidence that Euclid was a black woman. And recently we had an international seminar, and I put up this on my blog, so you can search that out, where again this question was raised, what does it matter whether Euclid was a white man or a black woman? So that question is answered here. Okay. So I want to get into the politics of saving the Euclid myth. There are three types of vested interests. The first is that of white racists. And they want to claim that whites are superior since they created a superior kind of mathematics. That is precisely the point made by this lady who responded to my talk. Then there are formal mathematicians. That formal mathematics, which I call Western ethno-mathematics, is the superior way to teach mathematics, and that is something we follow in all our universities currently. That is how we teach mathematics. Then the third thing, and the unexpected thing, is church dogma. So I think very few people understand that the Euclid myth is essential to post-crusade church dogma. The post-crusade church theology of reason. And I think that that is something which people need to understand, because it's something very deeply hidden. So, and the key point of today's talk is that these vested interests are interconnected. That church dogma is interconnected with formal mathematics, is interconnected with the claim of white superiority. And racism is actually about the sense of superiority, religious superiority, white superiority, Western superiority, not primarily about the color of the skin. And when I say Euclid must fall, it is meant to destroy that sense of superiority. Okay, so let me start with the question that, apartheid, segregation, slavery has gone on for 5 centuries. South Africa just got over a few years ago. Less than a quarter century ago. Segregation continued for well over a century. Slavery of blacks in Americas, both Americas, went on from the 16th century until the 19th century. And today racism still persists. I mean, the Rhodes Must Fall is a classic example. Peter Floyd and so on. I don't need to go into that. All of you are very familiar with that. Now, racism is cruel. It is ethically depraved. This has been much discussed, but I want to discuss something else. The belief that the color of the skin makes one human being superior to another is an exceptionally foolish belief. How did Westerners accept this exceptionally foolish belief for so long? 5 centuries we are talking about. There has to be something wrong, very wrong. And it's not only the common people. The common people do it okay, but top Western intellects like Immanuel Kant, Locke, and so on, they all accepted this foolish belief. The whole systems of ethics, law, and governance in the West, which are based on this foolish belief for centuries. So my question is, why were races collectively and individually so foolish? Western scholars have never asked this question. I don't know. I mean, why not? So the reason I think is quite obvious. They're merely asking the question militates against the white Western sense of superiority. And that sense of superiority, rather than the color of the skin, is at the core of racism. Now, a persistent and foolish belief, it has persisted for more than 5 centuries, is a superstition. All right. And in the West, the church is the key source of superstitions. So, for example, you have I suppose all of you are familiar with this, the Bible defense of slavery, which was just before just before the so-called Proclamation of Emancipation, just before the end of the Civil War in America. This was being widely circulated. So this is available online, and it was a very popular book, went into 5 editions. That the black color of the skin is not due to the heat of the sun, but it is due to the curse of the Christian God, the curse of Kam. And I think you are all familiar with that, but this is a superstition. I just want to underline that. So the question again is, why were Westerners so foolish and superstitious for so long? And the question needs to be broadened. It's not appropriate to study slavery alone. You must study genocide and slavery. Genocide plus slavery, and in fact the age of enlightenment, as it is called, should perhaps better be called the age of genocide plus slavery. And you must include the genocide not only of blacks but of indigenous people. You can't just say the genocide of the Red Indians or something separate from the genocide of the Maya, or the Inca, the Aztecs, or the Australian Aborigines. That's the principle of Occam's razor, that you have a simplicity of causes. And genocide is related to slavery even economically, that the genocide provided the free of cost land, slavery provided the free of cost labor, and of course in Australia convicts were used. So that is the basis of Western wealth. If somebody has the mic on, please, can you switch it off? So the Europeans who engaged in genocide, the question is, did they lack moral compunctions? Did they have any? They did have, but the dominant morality at that time was church morality, and the church thought it moral to demand genocide or enslavement of all non-Christians. This is stated in the Bull Romanus Pontifex, and you can check this out, meaning of Christian discovery. Here is the Bull Romanus Pontifex, and so on, how this was that invade, search, capture, vanquish, subdue all Saracens and pagans and others, and reduce their persons to perpetual slavery and so on. It is quite a vicious document, and it is a papal bull. And this was the Bull Romanus Pontifex, which has never been withdrawn. Likewise, there was the Bull Inter Cetera, which declared that all non-Christians lost their right to land on being discovered by Christians, as upheld by the US Supreme Court. That's still the law in the US, and you can find the reference in that article I just showed you. So it was the biggest hate crime in history, as described at first hand by Las Casas, Bartolome de las Casas, who accompanied Columbus on his second voyage. And then, you know, the things they said, that while there, you offspring of the devil, etc. It was a religious hate crime and not anything to do with race. And the criminals thought they were being moral because they were only imitating what God would do in hell. So this makes it clear that in the 15th and 16th century, genocide and slavery were justified using religion, no mention of race anywhere. So we have a new answer to the question raised, for example, by Theodore Allen. What came first, whiteness or slavery? It's the sense of superiority which came first, based on Christian church dogma, that Christians are superior and ought to kill and enslave non-Christians. And that was the initial ground. Now, this moral justification ran into trouble after the transatlantic slave trade, when many black Africans converted to Christianity. And that is when they shifted to the curse of Kam that the blacks are inferior Christians. But why use the color of the skin? Well, that was an inquisitional practice. So the Inquisition, the inquisitors had earlier used quick visual cues, such as adherence to Moorish dress, to spot suspect Christian converts among the Moor, and of course subject them to all kinds of inhumane tortures. So the biblical justification was thin. So if we look at Immanuel Kant, he uses a different secular justification for his recommendation to whip blacks. He echoed Hume that blacks are not creative. But my question is, would Kant and Hume have used this argument if they believed George James? George James' stolen legacy, I mean, not in the sense that Aristotle literally plagiarized from the great library of Alexandria, but that Greek philosophy is derived from Egyptian. It could be due to translations from Egyptian and Persian. So I don't know if you have seen this. This is from the Sacred Books of the East, volume 37. It is the Dinkard. So the evil, destined villain Alexander, he translated the Zendavesta into Greek. That is what it says. And he burnt many of the texts. So this process has been going on. But there were later appropriations motivated by racist historians, as in Bernard's Black Athena. There could be even simpler accretion into later date texts. For example, there are no primary sources for Archimedes. So I'm quoting David Fowler. We possess no original versions of any Greek mathematical text. And the only thing that we have got is something which was reconstructed in the 19th century from some texts which were lost in the 16th century. So there are no sources. These are all conjectures. All conjectures and about what Archimedes did. And the point is, this is based on accretion. If you have a 16th century scientific text, it reflects 16th century scientific knowledge, because scientific texts are updated. You don't just keep doing it for historical reasons. You do it for practical value. And then I had given 5 lectures in Pretoria on Not Out of Greece. All these things are covered there. I'll simply summarize. When the church first incorporated the myth of Christian superiority into its dogma, it also created a secular justification using false history. And Orosio's history against the pagans is the prime example. And this trick went ballistic during the Crusades, after the Crusades, when a false history of science was concocted. And it was difficult to win the Crusades. It went on for 5 centuries because the Muslim Europe particularly was scientifically far ahead of Christian Europe. Today is Eid Mubarak, by the way, if there are any Muslims around. So the church appropriated all scientific knowledge in Arabic texts, and to make it theologically correct, because the church had earlier burnt all books, it attributed them to early Greeks. Why? Because Greeks were declared as the sole friends of Christians, so that made it a Christian inheritance, just this attribution. Whether you have evidence for it or not, people did not ask during the Crusades. And the myth of Euclid is precisely such a myth with no evidence whatsoever. There is no primary Greek text which has Euclid's name in it. It is well known. It's simply not there. Now, you have zero evidence, and Euclides could mean rational geometry, a possible subtitle, and there is plenty of counter evidence. As I think I showed you this book already, my book Euclid and Jesus. You can read that. It summarizes everything. It's available on Kindle Unlimited. Just take a look. So Euclid was appropriated. The interesting point is this appropriation was done for reasons related to church dogma. I'll come back to that. So the shift from religious superiority to racist superiority saw a corresponding adjustment that Greeks were now portrayed as whites, as they still are, rather than as friends of Christians. Now I want to go to Du Bois' dream, because I think you need to expand the question further. Du Bois in his Dark Princess realized that you have to include colonialism. And his dream was that the colonized were equally oppressed. So he thought of uniting all the colonized against the oppressor and thus freeing them. And after the collapse of colonialism following World War II and the collapse of the idea of a unipolar world given the rise of China, that dream is no longer a romance, but a realistic possibility. And what I want to emphasize is that false history is a key element of both racist and colonial claims of superiority, as, for example, put forward by Macaulay in India about the colonizer being immensely superior. But racist history further mutated after colonialism, given the wild conjectures about the Aryan race grew after William Jones' 1786 linguistic observation, and that led to the belief that the colonized were of the same race as the mythical Aryans as the colonizer. And so the claim of racist superiority further mutated into a claim of civilizational superiority. So this is what I'm saying. It started off with the idea of Christian superiority. After the transatlantic slave trade, there was the conversion of blacks, and that led to ultimately to the idea of white superiority. And after colonialism and the Aryan race conjecture, that led to the idea of Western superiority. But it's all based on false history. Okay. So these are not the only two models. You know, it's not just the Crusades and so on. There's the Inquisitional model. For example, Copernicus. You know, after the fall of the Constantinople, Istanbul, a whole lot of Byzantine Greek texts came to Europe. And Copernicus, who translated one such text available in the Vatican Library, was declared as the originator. And he had to hide it because he was afraid of the Inquisition. And that's a big story of Copernican revolution. Likewise, the doctrine of Christian discovery was applied not only to land, but also to knowledge. The first Christian discoverer becomes the owner of that knowledge. And that is how the discovery of calculus is attributed to Newton and Leibniz. And let me, as I said, well, since we are in Germany, let me explain this Leibniz series, so-called. This is found in an Indian text called the Yukti Bhasha. It is Yukti Deepika, I'm sorry. This is the Sanskrit slok. I want it is translated in my book. But this is the mathematical translation. It's an infinite series for pi. And this is precisely what is called the Leibniz series. And why do I say that nobody understood it? Because nobody, neither Leibniz, nor Galileo, nor Descartes, nor Newton, nor Berkeley, knew how to sum an infinite series. All right, this was the major problem. And that was the epistemological problem regarding the calculus in Europe. So, and as I said, it was transmitted by Cochin-based Jesuits. And please take a look at this epistemic test. I think I showed this to you already. Okay. So, all right. Since I want to focus on philosophy, I would like to not go further into history because it will take a lot of time. And let me go into the philosophical aspects. Point is that bad history results in bad philosophy. So Kant's ethical conclusion that blacks, since not creative, should be whipped into silence, it's a bad ethical conclusion. So bad philosophy based on bad history. And so to bring out how obnoxious this conclusion is actually, I mean, we could ask, should Kant's followers be whipped into silence? I'm sure a lot of people are going to protest, but that is a logical thing to ask. So anyway, the false myth of Euclid results in a bad philosophy of mathematics. And this false myth is not confined to who is the author of a particular book. That's not the most important issue. The issue is about the contents of the book. And you would imagine there can be no controversy about the contents of the book. The book has been known for 500 years, 700 years. One would imagine that somebody actually read the book. But the myth is about the contents of the book. That on the myth, the book first gave axiomatic proofs in geometry. is completely false. If the book Elements does not have a single axiomatic proof. And let me just clarify what is an axiom. An axiom is a postulate and an assumption, not a self-evident truth. There is no such thing as a self-evident truth. And the definition of an axiomatic proof is that it is a sequence of propositions in which each proposition is either an axiom or is derived from preceding propositions by some rule of reasoning. It could be various rules of reasoning. For example, classic, so to say, Aristotelian rule is A implies B, therefore B. The important point here is that facts are excluded and observations are also excluded. Anything empirical is excluded. That is to say, I cannot say A is a fact, therefore A. I cannot say I observe A, therefore A. So that's the difference between formal and normal reasoning. That axiomatic or formal reasoning is reasoning minus facts. It differs from normal or scientific reasoning, which was used worldwide, which is reasoning with facts. So let's take the normal inference that the earth is round. Now the 5th century Aryabhat, he said that the earth is round. It's a sphere which stands supportless in space. All right, like a kadam flower, it's a round flower. So he explained. What did he explain? I mean, this is the Shishadi Vriddhit, as it is called. It is too complicated to write in English with diacriticals. And maybe you can take a look at this article, which gives the translation of Shishadi Vriddhit 2036. If the earth is level, why can't tall trees be seen? When they are at very great distance, as you know, ships disappear over the horizon. So these are the arguments that were given, very simple, down-to-earth arguments for the earth being round. So it was an inference. Point I'm making is nobody went to space and saw it. It was inferred from the fact that far-off trees cannot be seen. But it was inferred from a fact, not an axiom. You observe that far-off trees cannot be seen. And therefore, you infer that the earth is round. Okay? Or you infer that the horizon is circular, and that's the added thing. I have not added that. Likewise, there is a normal proof of the Pythagorean theorem from the Yukti Bhasha. So this is how the proof goes. Here you have one square based on one side, and then on top of it, you put the square based on the other side. One is called Bhuj, the other is called Koti. And now you measure out the Bhuj. That is an empirical process, measuring it out. You cut it here and you draw this. And you cut this triangle like this, you cut this triangle like this, rotate it like that, rotate that like this, and you can see that the sum of these two squares is equal to the square on the diagonal. But the point is, this is a proof. But it is not a formal proof because it includes empirical elements. I can see that this is the case. I have to move things in space. I have to worry about rigid motions and so on. So it involves a diagram and so on, and you're superposing. Superposition is the problem. And you observe that the two areas are equal. Now with normal reasoning, the point is, if you are using empirical facts, the order of the propositions is not critically important. So the Yukti Bhasha, in the Yukti Bhasha, the Pythagorean proposition is the first proposition, not the last as it is in the Elements. So on the Euclid myth, the Euclid's primary contribution was the arrangement of the propositions, the order of the propositions in the Elements, so that the proof of each proposition depended only on the preceding propositions. But now the strange thing is 750 years of European myth about mathematics. Extraordinary. The book was a prescribed text. Nobody read it. All right. It is repeated. The myth is repeated that there are axiomatic proofs in the Elements in the foolish Cambridge exam regulation towards the end of the 19th century for the previous and local examinations. So I have put it up on my website that this is what they said. Proofs other than Euclid's will be admitted, but Euclid's axioms will be required, and no proof of any proposition will be accepted which assumes anything not proved in the preceding propositions in Euclid. Okay, you must stick to the order of in which the propositions in Euclid occur. That is mandatory. It is part of the exam regulations. It is something passed by the University of Cambridge. So all the dons must have read it. And this is after 750 years of seeing this book. So please take a look. This is on my website. I've given you the link and I will give it to you again. It's publicly posted. So why do I call this foolish? Because nobody read the book. The amazing fact, in 750 years, they had this myth and nobody read the book because there are no axiomatic proofs in the elements. And as a matter of fact, the more laughable thing is that the text which was prescribed by Cambridge had all empirical proofs. That text is also put up on my website. You can check it out. So the book Elements has no axiomatic proofs, not of the first proposition, not of the last. I'm sorry. So the first proposition is about drawing an equilateral triangle on a given line segment. So you take the compass, put it here, draw one arc, take another compass, take the same radius, the compass, put the center here and draw another arc, and where they intersect, you join. And that would be an equilateral triangle. But the point is, you see that these arcs intersect. How do you know that they intersect? How do you know it axiomatically? You don't know. So there is no, even of the first proposition, there is no axiomatic proof. And likewise, there is no proposition, or there is no axiomatic proof of proposition 4, the side angle side theorem, where you have two triangles which have equal sides, and the word is equal, by the way, in the elements, not congruent. That was a word later introduced by Hilbert. So you take the one triangle, put it on top of another triangle, you superpose, and you see, you observe that they are equal, and therefore you conclude that this proposition holds. But this empirical process, this is an empirical process, not allowed in formal mathematics. So if you don't believe me and you won't read the book, then you know, it is something very strange that all Europeans fail to carefully read this prescribed text and even its first proposition in 750 years. I mean, it's an amazing record. So here is the colonial proof. So what is the colonial proof? The colonial proof is that you must have Western authorities. Western authorities must say something, only then it is credible. We don't have the capacity to check it ourselves. That is something very sad. And anyway, let me give you that proof. Dedekind, Russell, and Hilbert, what they had to say. So Dedekind tried to correct the proof of proposition 1 using what are called Dedekind cuts, which later came to be known as formal real numbers. Russell wrote that the proof of proposition 4 is a tissue of nonsense. So I'll give you this text on the teaching of Euclid by Russell. So the fourth proposition is a tissue of nonsense because it is using superposition, and superposition is an empirical process, and Russell is absolutely not happy with that. So tissue of nonsense. David Hilbert, he wrote a whole book, Foundations of Geometry. So this was in 1898, 99 maybe, finalized in 99. So I have the book here on this link, but I won't go into that. It's available online and it's available on my site. So the point is, Hilbert's aim was to provide the axiomatic proofs missing in Euclid, and of course the missing axioms. And of course in the process he completely changed the book. It is synthetic geometry, no length measurements are allowed. And if you are interested in further mathematical details, please join my geometry workshop next month. Today my talk concerns racism and the related underlying political claim, so I will come back to that. That this is a civilizationally superior form of mathematics, axiomatic mathematics. I want to come back to that it's not civilizationally superior. So it is based on a false claim of Euclid and his purported axiomatic proofs which don't exist. And the point is that this false claim of superiority is still being peddled in Indian school texts, in Wikipedia and so on. It is being peddled by reputed Western historians, the top Western historians, Needham, Gillings, Claggett. 100 years after it has been publicly exposed to be complete nonsense. They won't read and they won't listen to this. They just stick to the myth. Now, what do you call such a person? They won't listen to, they won't read, they won't look at facts. They will go by the big myth. So you call them gradients. So the complete disregard of easily verifiable facts, which have been publicly admitted over a century ago, that there are no axiomatic proofs. This entitles them to the title of gradients. And why am I using this? Because Cleggett said the Egyptians did not know the Pythagorean theorem, and anybody who says is a pyramidiot. So I think that it deserves to be returned, the compliment, and people need to be called gradients, and there are far too many of them. But the prize, the gradients prize, goes to Lefkowitz. So if you recall, Shekanta Dio pointed out that the Ames, the Rhine Papyrus, problem 41. So this is the problem 41. I don't really understand Egyptian, so I can just show it to you, but I won't, I will just give you what the translation is. If you question the translation, and I will leave it to you to decide. It has the right formula for the volume of a cylindrical granule. And that formula is very simple. Take the diameter, subtract diameter by 9, square it. And that gives you the right formula and the right value of pi, which is approximately 3.16. Recall also that the sphere and cylinder is attributed to Archimedes, a book called Sphere and Cylinder, based on accretive sources from after the 16th century, reconstructed in the racist 19th century. But Lefkowitz, see what she asserts. She says, not out of Africa, page 153, that Archimedes determined that the volume of the cylinder was 3/2 the area of the sphere. My goodness. So comparing volumes and areas and based on 16th century text, but let's get back to the mainline story. Deadkind, Hilbert, Russell rejected the myth of axiomatic proofs, but they accepted the superstition that axiomatic proofs are superior. They all tried to provide axiomatic proofs. Russell wrote his Principia Mathematica. Hilbert had his foundations of geometry, foundations of mathematics, and so on. So the question, are axiomatic formal proofs superior? And if they are superior, for what purpose are they superior? To whom are they superior? So as I said, Euclid is Aklides, which is related to Akli Kalam or Islamic rational theology. So during the Crusades, when the church suddenly switched to Christian rational theology of reason, of Aquinas and schoolmen, why did it do that? Because they failed to convert Muslims by force the way Europe was converted to Christianity by force earlier. Because militarily, after the first crusade, all the remaining crusades were failures for centuries. Muslims could not be converted using the Bible either, but they accepted the reason, as in the Islamic theology of reason, Islamic rational theology, which came from Ibn Rushd, which was taught as a textbook in Oxford and Cambridge for a long time. Eberhard. So church too decided to adopt reason, but how? So they gave reason a Greek ancestry because there is no mention of reason in the Bible. But why? Isn't reason against church superstition? People keep talking of rationality these days. Rationality, let's be rational. But no, the unique thing discovered by the church was that, I have an article on that, the church connection to reason. So the link is here. I'll put it up. Please take a look at it. The point is, church facts go against church dogma, not reason alone. And Aquinas demonstrated it. So the church accepted reason minus facts. That's your formal reasoning. Reasoning, but based on axioms, not facts. That's the startling innovation made by the church. So the starting point of reasoning would be an axiom or assumption, not a fact. So Aquinas used this in his Summa Theologica. So how many angels can fit on a pin? That's the question he asks. And people will tell you this is not real. That they did not ask such questions. So here is the reference to Summa Theologica. How many angels can be there on a pin? In the same place, right? This is very much there in Summa Theologica. So take a look at it. And he starts on an axiom that angels occupy no space. And if angels occupy no space, There are no facts about angels. How do I know what the angels do, whether they have 4 wings or 5, or what they do, whether they dance on one leg, or you can assume anything you like. And you can prove whatever you want to prove. What you assume depends on what you want to prove. So, formal reasoning greatly suited the church for its theology of reason and was hence glorified by the church. It was read into Euclid where it did not exist. And that hid the tricky church invention. Because it was a brazen misreading because there are no such proofs. But in fact, the book is full of figures which are not rigorous, as Dedekind says, and they are logically worthless, as Russell says. But the diagrams in the book relate to mathesis. And Proclus specifically says that they relate to Plato's idea of mathesis as described in Meno. I won't go into that, I've shown it several times. But Phaedo, so let me just search for diagrams here. So what proofs are given of this doctrine of recollection, mathesis, is that the soul recollects its past lives, knowledge it has acquired in its past lives. Mathesis is learning. That is what learning is. All learning is recollection. So he says that this can be most clearly shown when you take a person to a diagram or to anything of that sort. So this is Plato, Phaedo, and you can likewise look at Meno, where he describes in great detail Socrates' dialogue with the slave boy, why geometry is related to the arousal of the soul. So that means that the elements was about mathesis, not about irrefragable proof, which was the point politically needed by the church. So it just modified the facts. And everybody believed for 750 years. That is what is most shocking. All the top minds of the West believed it. Without verifying, they still believe it. So the theorem proving mathematics is declared superior because it served the church's political purposes. But formal theorems are not superior in practical value. Unfortunately, because many people have the it works superstition. How can we change mathematics? It works. See, what works? So what works is normal mathematics. That has always worked. It's very ancient. Not Western formal math, which came after the Crusades. So Egyptians built pyramids long before that. How did they manage? Bridges were built before that by Incas, by Arabs, and so on. You do your groceries every day without knowing the formal proof of 1 + 1 = 2. And that ab initio formal proof in real numbers is my Cape Town challenge. Nobody has met it yet. What is the formal proof of 1 + 1 = 2? Russell takes 378 pages for integers. For real numbers, you'll need 1,000 pages. So you don't need it. Now, for practical purposes, like calculation of rocket trajectories, people want it for science. I have calculated rocket trajectories, right? What you do is you use a computer. You use normal math, all right? And formal, what does a computer do? It does not use real numbers. It uses floats. If you teach calculus in the university, all those fat calculus sects, they will say real numbers are essential for calculus. Okay, but trajectory calculations for rockets are done using computers which use floating point numbers, not real numbers. And those floating point numbers don't even obey the associative law for addition. And the calculus is made better if you use the Indian non-Archimedean arithmetic. But who lays down the axioms? Somebody in the West. And they follow them even in China. It's a very terrific irony. So the trick is to plant a superstition and make you obedient to and dependent on Western authority. And you have to understand that trick. The superstitions are not just about all sorts of angels and so on. Superstitions are also about mathematics. So formal theorems fail in real life because axioms and assumptions fail. And well, I gave an example of the associative law. But the Pythagorean theorem failed for the practical application to the European navigational problem. So you see, what they did was they had a method of a ship was going, so they did not know how to measure longitude until the 18th century. So they heaved the log. They threw a log and measured its speed and calculated the distance. They checked out the latitude difference, and then they calculated the longitudinal difference and thus calculated the longitude. But this was a problem. It led to huge navigational disasters until the 18th century. Why? Because you're applying the, first of all, you're applying a Pythagorean calculation. I'll come to that. And this problem was recognized by government, British Parliament legislated the longitude prize in 1713. Indians understood this long ago. No, why does the Pythagorean theorem fail? Because the sphericity of the earth. So you see, if you have a spherical triangle and so on, it's not going to obey this theorem that you're talking about. And this is explicitly stated in the Mahabhaskariya. Taking a lot of time. Okay, never mind. I'll skip that, but it is there. The link will work. And the point is that the Pythagorean theorem, it's not good enough to say it's an approximation. That's an inadequate defense. Why is it an inadequate defense? Because an approximation is worthless without error bounds. You tell somebody, oh, you are approximately, near Berlin. What is approximate? Could be 1,000 miles, could be, 1,000 meters or whatever. So you must state your error bounds, and they are not available because the theorem is exact. It doesn't state what your error bounds for Pythagorean theorem are. And even if you were to state error bounds, you would need knowledge of the radius of the earth, which was not known to Europeans until the late 17th century. What you need is not the theorem, you need the calculation, Pythagorean calculation, all right? And what is the difference? You will say, your difference is that you are calculating square roots. And square roots were unknown to Greeks, but were known to early Egyptians, Iraqis, and Indians. I have an article on that, which is called Black Thoughts Matter. And there's a detailed discussion of that in this article in Journal of Black Studies. So the calculation of square root of 2 involves an infinite series, hence it is forever inexact. So inexact calculation versus proof of exact theorem, that is the thing that we are talking about. Normal math is always about inexact calculation, not about theorem proof. Now the last question I would like to ask is theorem proving even epistemically superior? And the reason given is that empirical proofs are fallible. That's true. Everybody accepts it. But the idea that deduction is infallible is a mere superstition. See how many superstitions underlying mathematics. Any math teacher knows that students are often and they submit wrong proofs all the time. Not just students, authorities to submit wrong proofs. They have published many wrong proofs. So deduction is far more fallible than empirical proof. And reasoning, basically the human mind is more fallible than the senses. So this is my article on decolonizing mathematics in this University of Durban journal. They called me for a keynote. So it's available for free. So please take a look. So I'm giving a simple example. Game of chess is an exercise in pure deduction. All right. If neither side makes an error, it must end in a draw. But every human being, including the biggest grandmaster, the world champion, makes an error in deduction every time. Almost every time, may succeed once in a while by chance, hence loses to a computer. All right, so that is there. Plus, even if you have a valid deduction, it is invalid knowledge. No, because they assume the axioms may not be true in the real world. I already gave you an example, and there are lots of other examples like the Banach-Tarski theorem of set theory, which uses the axiom of choice. And this says that if you have one ball of gold, you can cut it into pieces, finite number of pieces, reassemble them, and you will get 2 balls of gold of the same size, of the same size, so you can become infinitely rich. Now, do you believe this nonsense? It's a theorem of set theory, and set theory is the basis of all formal mathematics as it is done today. But the point is, any nonsense proposition whatsoever can be proved as a formal theorem by selecting the axioms appropriately. So what's the point in doing that? So the assertion is that it is contingent versus necessary truth. That Church said that logic binds God, who can create facts of his choice, but not an illogical world. So you believe that facts are contingent. God could create the facts of his choice. So you can have facts which are true in some Wittgensteinian words. Now, if you're talking in logic, you won't talk about God, you will talk about Wittgenstein. So but the relation of axioms to theorems is a necessary truth which will be true in all worlds. That is a belief. It's a wrong belief. It's a wrong belief because it parochially assumes two-valued logic. But logic too can vary. So logic is not unique, not certain. Now I have this article from a long time. It's there in my 2004 book, Buddhist logic and Jain logic and so on, Syadvad, Buddhist Chatushkoti. So how do you decide logic? If you decide it culturally, then mathematical theorems are mere relative cultural truths. If you decide it empirically, then you have to look at quantum logic. So I've discussed it in great detail in my book, Quantum Logic Based on Structured Time. So it is not even truth functional. So you can have Schrodinger's cat both alive and dead at one given instant of time, and there is no contradiction. You cannot deduce anything you like from it. So the point is, how is logic to be decided? If I decide it empirically, there may be possible error, so I have to do it inductively. So deduction is already weaker than induction. Let me go to the conclusion. I hope I have not overstretched my time. That the church role in genocide, slavery, and racism has been ignored. It was first mandated. Genocide and slavery were mandated by the church in the bulls Romanus Pontifex and Intercultural. This was accepted also by Protestants and the US Supreme Court. Till today, it's not been changed. So the underlying dogma of extreme Christian superiority was justified using false history and a false history of science later from 12th century onwards. So what is the action that you need to do? Hold the church responsible for genocide plus slavery. I mean, you join the indigenes to condemn the church and demand that the church recant publicly. You don't want to kill anybody. Let them acknowledge their mistake publicly and let them stop giving moral advice for at least another 500 years after having given such bad advice. About the history of science, recognize that false history of Greeks and science is a centuries-old church con trick. Don't fall for it. Okay, it's the basis of false claims of superiority as used by Kant to support racism. To overthrow it, you insist on primary sources for history. Learn to distrust Western authority. Don't trust people just because they are from Harvard or Cambridge, and don't trust Wikipedia at all. Ask for primary evidence. Use non-textual evidence to cross-check. You know, Greeks didn't know how they had a bad calendar. They didn't know how to write numbers. How could they have done this and that? And start your own courses in history, philosophy, or science in your country. I have designed one course, but you design your own. But please start it. Please take up the subject. It's not trivial. So as far as Euclid is concerned, it's an important symbol of the false history of math concocted during the Crusades. It's a total falsehood. Euclid did not exist, did not invent axiomatic proof, no axiomatic proof. So axiomatic reasoning is an invention of the crusading church, very convenient, but it is not superior. Convenient for Christian rational theology. It's not superior in any sense of the word. It has no practical value, no special epistemic value. So Euclid must fall. Destroying symbols is important, but not enough. Okay? So abandon Western formal math, which is an instrument to promote white Western authority, because you can't make your own axioms. Somebody make the axioms of set theory. Somebody decided how the calculus should be done with real numbers, and everybody has to do it. So start teaching practical, normal math, which makes math easy, as I have demonstrated. For example, calculus without limits, or this traditional string geometry, which was done in India and Africa. I have a textbook on that for schools. String geometry for class 9, which is demonstrating how this was done. This text is available. So why for schools? Because calculus can be done in the universities, but school is where they start learning stuff, or decolonize statistics. I think I will stop at that point, since I have I have completed 55 minutes almost. So this was a talk I gave at JNU on statistics for social science and humanities. So I will stop there. Thank you very much for patiently listening to me. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Raju, for that very powerful presentation. I mean, I think I speak for everyone when we say that your talk brought to our knowledge a lot of very important things that I'm sure people are going to discuss in this question and answer session we are going to have just now. So if you have a question, just raise your hands and I will call you. Please be brief we don't have much time. So if you have questions, raise your hands. I can at least give us your question very briefly.
All right. Good morning, Professor Sikeraju. Thank you very much for that very important and very exciting speech that you have given concerning Euclid and the Pythagorean theorem. I have two questions precisely. I read one of your essays titled Black Thoughts Matter, and there you decided to give a $3,300 prize to whoever can prove that Pythagoras actually existed. I want you to please.
Euclid, yes,
Euclid.
Yeah. Pythagoras didn't exist, that is taken for granted.
Okay, so I would want you to expatiate on that, because I wanted to know if people have actually attempted to prove and what you think is wrong with those proofs. The second question I would like you to also address is connected to my research, because I'm also into mathematics. And I'm arguing that the binary base 2 numbering pattern is actually linked with the divination pattern of many sub-Saharan African peoples. And this has also been credited to Gottfried Leibniz as well. I would want to know if you have one or two things to say about that. Thank you very much, Professor Raju.
Your first question, quite simple. I gave this prize in that I gave you the Goodbye Euclid video, and this was announced in front of the Malaysian Deputy Education Minister, and nobody has claimed it. Nobody has claimed the prize because, as I said, everybody knows that there is no primary evidence for Euclid. And David Fowler admitted it in the year 2002. He was the expert who knew the primary sources. But it is a big myth. And as I said, lots of people, including Needham and so on, or Gillings and so on, will keep talking about this myth as if the West did something superior. Now, your second question, I'm not quite sure I understood. Are you talking about the binary system? I didn't quite get your second question.
Yeah, the binary.
Binary system.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yes.
The binary system. Now, I have not investigated that. I do know about the binary system being used in Indian texts, but you are talking about the Yoruba, right?
Yes.
So
I am.
I have not. I see history is too difficult thing for one person to do. I don't understand the local language. There's so many languages in the world. So it is a collective enterprise. You have to come out with things, and we can discuss and then write what needs to be done. So there are so many languages in the world. This is what I also used to tell my students. You please do something. I cannot do everything. I can only do what I know in my country, right? So it is your job to do this, right? All right. Okay. Thank you.
All right.
There
are some questions in the chat.
Okay.
Just check.
Yes, I see Christiana Itika has her hand raised up. After Christiana, we'll go to Maduka Eyimba. So Christiana, you have the floor. Ask your very brief question.
All right. Thank you, Professor Raju, for this very engaging presentation. Thought-provoking, at some point also so annoying. So I will not explain what those things mean. It's not necessary. First is a remark. And that remark has to do with what you said about the cause. Instead of the cause of calm, I think it is the cause of harm.
Yeah.
It is not calm. So I want to correct that because of the audience.
Curse of Cam from Kemet. And it is also called curse of Ham. Now, exactly how you translate it is, it's not an error. It is called curse of Cam and also curse of Ham. So both the things are there, and you can check that out. So Cam from Kemet, and that is why black.
You are not. That brings me now to my next question, because you are talking about authority. Okay. So, and you said quoting Western authority is what gives legitimacy or validity to an argument. So how do you justify your own authority in this context now?
I don't have any authority.
Let me finish.
I have no authority at all.
No, let me finish. I'm not talking about you because the information you gave or the presentation and the argument you presented, I am sure when you are saying false history and what you are trying to do is to correct the false history. That means you are working with a book or a text or a history or source of wherever is the source of your data, because these things you are naming 6th century, 7th century, you were not there that time. So it must be, you must have gotten it from somewhere in order to back up your argument. Okay.
Yeah, I have primary sources. Okay. I have primary sources which are all cited. For example, when I talked of what was happening in the Crusades, I talked of Summa Theologica. And I gave you a primary source, which was Aquinas Summa Theologica. Or if you like,
now I am coming. You are not allowing me to finish my question. Please. So my question is, even these primary sources, okay, how do you even validate the truth of the content of those sources? Okay, because it is the same argument that you used in terms of false presentations that you can find in some other texts. That is one. Second is that when you talk about foolishness, I wonder what you would say about Gandhi, who also had the same foolish concept about the Africans. Okay, in this context of people using color to define superiority and inferiority, because Gandhi himself also argued that the Indians are superior to the blacks, whatever his reason for that. So I wonder if that foolishness is applied to Gandhi, okay, in that context. And finally, when you talked about the Islamic rational theology and church or Christian theology of reason, also you have to if you are looking, I don't know how authoritative those sources will be, but then how Muhammad emerged with the Islamic religion has nothing to do with rationality. Just like Christianity also can be, without reason, borrowing from non-existent Euclid. Okay, the same thing is applicable to even Islamic religion, because it has no rational foundation from the perspective of Muhammad. So I would like you to comment on these things, on my observations anyway.
Okay, so regarding your first question, I not only talk, you can question my primary sources. Which primary source are you questioning? That's number one. You can't just say, you have something wrong with primary sources. No, you can't start with belief. You have to be specific. I question this primary source of yours. You have not done that. So please be specific. That's number one. Number two, I don't go just by textual sources. I emphasized in my conclusion that you use non-textual sources. Where is the non-textual evidence that Greeks could do any basic arithmetic? They never had any algorithms. Where is the textual source? Where is the non-textual evidence? You have non-textual evidence of the calendar, that they were extremely bad. They had an extremely bad calendar. So use non-textual sources as well in order to cross-check. That's number one. Now, I didn't get your second question. Let me go to your third question, which was about rationality in Islam. It is well known that there is an Islamic rational theology. Why are you talking about Muhammad? You talk about the practice of Islam as it existed. And the theology, the rational theory, what you talk of Aristotle, is based on the text of Eberhard. What were the texts of Aristotle that are available in terms of Greek? They are all texts of Eberhard in Arabic, which actually he uses the word philosopher. He doesn't use the word Aristotle. It was just some hearsay where in Arabic they called it Arastu. So there is no rationality whatsoever here, but this rationality came because of this whole school of rational theology based on with Eberhard being one of the examples, and Al-Ghazali, who's supposed to be the counter to Eberhard, actually does not deny. He writes a book on logic. So there is plenty of rationality in Islam, and don't just go on the basis of Muhammad. What are you talking about? We are talking about the practice. right?
I think you got my 3 questions wrong.
How do we talk?
You got my 3 questions wrong. So I am sorry. You got my 3 questions wrong.
Christiana, please, thank you so much. We don't have much time, so please let's allow.
Yes, but
we can have a discussion with.
He didn't get my questions right.
We can,
that's why the
discuss
answers
it later. Can we discuss it later?
Yeah.
Somebody else has a question. Yes, please.
Yeah. Maduka, please ask your questions very briefly and straight to the point.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Arabia, for the opportunity, and also to Professor Raju for that exciting lecture. I have just 2 questions. Number 1, in the course of your lecture, you stated categorically that racism is not about the color of the skin. And then again, as you continued, you stated 3 major
You are not audible.
If racism is not about color, why
you are not audible?
Dr. Maduka, please. Dr. Maduka, can you please repeat your first question? We didn't quite get you.
Yes, that in the course of the lecture, Professor Raju stated that racism is not about the color of the skin. He stated that very clearly. And then along the line, he also mentioned 3 major superiority vested interests from the West, namely Christian superiority, Western white superiority. Why should white superiority be part of the vested interest if skin color is not part of racism, or racism is not about number 1? Did you get that question now?
I didn't say it's not part of racism. I said it developed as part of, it's not the primary issue. It developed, the primary issue is the sense of superiority. All right? The primary issue is the question of superiority. And I'll come to Christina in a minute about Gandhi's foolishness you're talking about. So the question is about what is primary. If they said blacks are superior, you would not have a problem, would you? So it is something which develops later. It's something which develops later. And can I answer what Christina asked? I think that the thing which was written by this professor in Ghana, he has misquoted original text, totally misquoted. And it is shocking that people still believe it. I mean, you may have differences. I am not a supporter of Gandhi, but it is gross misquotation, gross academic, I mean, it's just third rate. That's all that I can say. It's complete misquotation, falsehood. Please read the sources. Yes, please. Somebody else has a question.
Thank you.
The Dean had a question.
Isaiah Negedu, please, your question. I think that would be the last question before we have to move on.
Yes, thank you, Arabia. Professor Raju, you said there is no such thing as a self-evident proof. Can you please explain that? Thank you.
There was a thing that said once upon a time that axioms are self-evident truths. All right. Now, that is something which has been abandoned, because how do you agree on what is a self-evident truth? Because it is not even manifest. It is not even empirical. Okay, even if it's empirical, it might be fallible. So axioms are today accepted as postulates. This is textbook stuff in school. And it is not something which is to be assumed to be, which is something everybody accepts as true, but only something which is a postulate. So that is the simple assumption, nothing more than that. A simple point, nothing more than that. Nobody can agree on what is a self-evident truth. And there are no axioms like that anyway. And there are no axioms like that in Euclid. So you might have things like, there is only one line between 2 points, that is Hilbert's axiom, one straight line between 2 points. But that's not necessarily true. It depends on what you call a point and so on. I think the Dean had a question. Can we get to him?
Yes, the person listed as Dean faculty, could you ask your question? Very briefly, please.
Thank you very much, Arabia. Yes, this is a very powerful presentation from Professor Raju. I really enjoyed it. It's not only powerful, thought-provoking, but it is also disruptive. It's a follow-up to Maduka's question. Perhaps the professor may want to explain the disconnect between skin color and superiority, because I didn't quite get it, because personally, I don't see that disconnect. Because for me, I think everything begins with the skin color. The skin color tells the host to say I am special, and because I'm special, I should think differently from the other race, from the other person with a different skin. So perhaps I think you may want to go further and explain why you think there's a disconnect between the skin color and the whole concept of superiority.
Yeah, thanks for the question. Now, I pointed out to Theodore Adam's work when he asked this question of what came first, whiteness or slavery. And the answer to that is very clearly, as I pointed out, if you are considering slavery is something that was promoted by the church. Not only in the sense that they had slaves, but in the sense that they thought it is very moral for people to have slaves. That was the initial point. Then at a later stage, it evolves, because after you have blacks converting to Christianity, after the transatlantic slave trade, then Christianity cannot be used to keep them enslaved, right? So what do? So they said there is a curse of Cam. And now once they have a curse of Cam, it is a very thin justification, because it's just one quotation from the Bible. And so what does Kant do? So therefore, Kant goes to the secular justification. He says blacks are not created. All right, so since skin color comes at that point of time, that they are Christians, but they are inferior Christians because of the curse of Cam. They are inferior because of the secularly inferior, because they are not created. That is Kant's argument. And now I'm saying that that argument is based on false history, and I'm saying that false history is a basic trick that the church has been using from the 4th century, right from the time of Orosius. That was publicly. They did not hide it in the 5th century. And Orosius writes, he did not hide. He says it's a good thing to tell lies in favor of the church. But this was hidden during the Crusades. So the skin color is there, but it's not the primary determining element. Because when you go to colonialism, it's not just a skin color. Now they're talking about race in the context of Aryans. But it's the same thesis that the colonizer is superior. Why? Because the colonizers have superior science, have superior mathematics. So it's the same false history of science which is being used in all three cases of religious superiority, racist superiority, civilizational superiority. So I'm saying that let us look at this as part of a much, much larger problem, which includes the indigenous Americans, Australians, which includes the colonized. And then you see that a certain pattern is falling through, that what you need to attack is really the history of science, the false history of science which has been given to us. That's my point.
Thank you, Prof. I think I'm answered.
Yeah, thank you so much. Even though we are running out of time, I can still take questions, because obviously this talk is a very good one, very interesting one, and people are willing to ask their questions. So I can see two other hands from Amara and Diana. So Amara first, then Diana next. Please ask your questions very briefly. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Prof, for your presentation. In your presentation, you seem to be in favor of us abandoning Western mathematics for indigenous mathematics. My question is, how can we implement this? That is my question. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for that question. Now, my argument is not for indigenous mathematics. My argument is for a better mathematics. I have made that clear hundreds of times. I am talking about better mathematics. And I'm saying that the myth you have got from the colonizer, that the kind of mathematics they do, the formal mathematics they do is better, is false. So I'm not saying that you do something just because it is indigenous. You do it because it is better. And calculus without limits is better. Simple thing is that nobody even understands what a real number is in the Cape Town debate. I challenge the mathematician to prove 1 + 1 = 2 in real numbers. That challenge is still open. Please take a look at my JNU video. That's the premier university in India. And so I think that this is, it is a point that is being made that calculus without limits is better, but the formal mathematician will not come to debate. They will censor. They will not talk. I've been inviting them for a debate for so long. They will never discuss it. Now that I think is a problem because they know that they have nothing to say. And I think that is the issue. Just as in the case of Euclid, I offered the prize because they have nothing to say. And that is why for 1 + 1 = 2, I offered this prize of ₹1,000,000. So I think that this is, of course, that can be done. It's not like Euclid, it can be done, it's just very hard. And so that prize was offered only for a limited amount of time. Now, I think that when you are looking at better mathematics, you need to examine what kind of mathematics you did. So for example, I told you about string geometry. Why don't you come and join my workshop? Or you take a look at my teaching of calculus without limits. Why do they tell lies? Why did your Cape Town people tell such terrible lies? If they have a solid argument, they should have come up with it. The moment people start telling lies, you know that they have a weak argument. So not indigenous, better. Let's be very clear about that. If it is also indigenous, that's a different matter. I'm not saying you exclude something indigenous, but use it not because it is indigenous, but because it is better.
All right, thank you. Diana, your question.
Thank you very much, Prof. Raju, for your insightful presentation. I am still a bit confused about your explanation on the racism thing. I think for one, for me, racism works in two mutual reinforcing ways. Like we talk about skin color, and then we talk about the mindset that characterizes this idea of racism. So I still think you haven't really explained how this racism works. And if it is not from skin color, I think you've not quite given us that explanation that speak to the fact that it is not from the skin. Because even if we come down to Africa, we will notice that people tend to privilege light-skinned individuals to black skin. So I think it is that understanding that it all starts from the skin. That is why we tend to also have this understanding of ourselves that black skin is not good enough. So I think you should give us more explanation why you think the skin color is not the problem, but the other way around.
Right. So let me go back to Theodore Allen's question. What came first? Whiteness came first or slavery came first? On what basis were blacks enslaved before the 16th century? Were they enslaved on the grounds that they were black? No. They were enslaved on the grounds that they were non-Christian. So the slavery came first, the idea of inferiority came first, and then when that idea could no longer be sustained, then the skin color was used as a quick visual clue. Is that point clear? I'm saying that was not the essence. Now I want to go to the next stage, that if you just stop with racism, you don't get a complete picture. You have to go to also to colonialism. And when you go to colonialism, it's no longer the issue of skin color, it's the issue of civilization. It was Christians first, whites later, and West subsequently. So it's a question of civilizational superiority. Now, I think the problem, I'm taking a much more general view of the problem, which is that there is a sense of superiority, and that sense of superiority is always based on one false history where the characters are slightly changed. So one time you talk of Christianity, sometime you talk of skin color, sometime you talk of civilization, but they are not unrelated, they are all just the same. That's the point I'm making. So what I'm saying is that you should not focus on that because there is a much bigger problem at hand and you can tackle the bigger problem. It's much easier. If you just keep talking of skin color, the problem won't go away because I'm talking about cure for racism. So how do you cure it? You cure it by attacking that sense of superiority. It's just not about skin color. It's about the sense of superiority, which you destroy. And how do you destroy? You destroy it by destroying these silly myths. which are used to say this is superior, this is superior. You destroy those myths of history of science, and then there will be a major change. So this is what I'm saying, that if you just get stuck on skin color, you're stuck to one problem. Then you say genocide of red Indians, that's another problem. No, it's not another problem, it's part of the problem. Or you say colonization, it's another problem. So that's why I talked of Du Bois' dream that you have to bring together all the oppressed people. And you can't be looking at just that, okay, in one case it was skin color, in one case it was something else, in one case it was something else. There are 100 different causes, then you can't solve the problem. So my argument is, or my submission, if you like, is that you should consider the bigger problem, and then you find that there is a reasonable understanding and a reasonable solution.
Okay, thank you. Bjorn, okay, you would be the last questioner. And this time you'll be serious about you being the last. So Bjorn, your question, very, very briefly.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's more a comment that really puzzles me and troubles me during the presentation, because I think the idea to talk about the reason why you argue for that kind of mathematics that you are arguing for is because of its inherent superiority seems very, very dangerous. I think this is one of the factors that was mainly responsible for the horrors of colonialism, this understanding of inherent superiority. Shouldn't we argue for diversity, for multiplicity of accounts, but and instead do not develop something that considers itself to superior to the former allegedly superior paradigm? I think this is a deeply troubling normative hierarchy that is foundational, as far as I understood it, for the argumentation that I've heard so far. And that I think that really troubles me. That was just a very brief comment. Thank you.
Okay, can I respond to that? I think that when you talk of diversity, where is the diversity? In the university syllabus, how do you teach mathematics? You teach it according to the calculus text. And they say real numbers, they say limits. You don't teach it any different way. So there is no room for diversity. So it's good to talk of diversity. How are you going to bring it in? First, at least make one simple change. So you are not able to bring in any kind of diversity. So merely talking of diversity from a very comfortable status quo is not going to convince anybody. It is like saying we are killing all the species and we should have diversity of species. So it is not an argument which helps me when I find that I am being oppressed. So first of all, we need to change. And now when you change, I am saying I want to fly a rocket. What method should I use? Should I use, okay, lots of, there can be different methods, but ultimately I will use the method which works best. I can't say I want lots of different methods, and so one method will, rocket will go here, one will go there. It becomes too expensive to experiment. So I have to first check that out. And what I am saying is that the way you actually do it is what way you should do it, and not by appealing to theology which is there in the text. So we can't have mere diversity when there is hegemony. On one side you have hegemony, on the other side you talk of diversity. Let's at least introduce one alternative course in mathematics. I've been trying for 10 years. Try and do it. Where is the diversity? Just talk of ethno-mathematics. Talk of real mathematics that you're doing. So I think that you need to look at that. And once you look at that, there has to be some comparison. All right, some comparison of what is better, what is worse for a particular purpose. Maybe something could be better for some other purpose. But for a particular purpose, you are going to decide. And you have always decided that whatever the colonial master brought, that has to be true. Why? I'm challenging it. When you're talking of diversity, why don't we accept the challenge and debate? So let's have a debate and let us see for what purpose, what thing is better. That would be so much better. So let's start with Euclid. Let's at least destroy that myth if there is no evidence for it. Why are we talking about it? So I think that it is not a mere question of diversity, not a mere question of ethno-mathematics, why is Western ethno-mathematics taught in all the universities? Are you going to have, you can have multiplicity of syllabi, I don't mind, but what have you done to change it? Has anywhere in the world one particular subject of mathematics been taught differently? Any university, give me one name. So there's no point in talking of diversity in some postmodernist sense, because that is an invitation for status quo. There are 5 billion truths, therefore do nothing, and therefore have status quo. Right? There is a problem there. All are equally applicable, therefore do nothing. So why do nothing? Let's first change the status quo, then we'll talk of diversity. And there is not even a single element, right? I think that's right.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you very much, Professor Raju, for your very, very insightful, thought-provoking talk today, your lecture today. It has lived up to our expectations, especially my expectations, having read a few of your articles and you know, dying to meet you and hear you speak. It was a wonderful lecture. I want to thank members of the CSP who actively engaged with Professor Raju in his talk, and other audience members who asked questions and made comments. I can even see some comments in the chat box and all that. Thank you very much, Professor Raju, for agreeing to give us this talk, give this lecture, and for being part of this program. Thank you so much. It's been wonderful. Thank you so much. So immediately we will go to the next presentation because we do not have much time. Time in listening to Professor Raju, and quite rightly so. So I'll call on the next presenter, who is Emmanuel Ofuasia, to give us his talk titled On the Distinction Between Friedrich Hegel's Dialectics and the Logic of Conversational Thinking. Emmanuel Ofuasia, you have the floor now.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. David Arabia. It's a privilege to be here, to be able to share with some of my fellow colleagues here what I think has been a misconception of the main thrust of conversational thinking and the logic that undergirds it. Perhaps I should start by telling everyone here that this motivation for research is born out of the unfair renditions and misrepresentations of Jonathan Chimakunam's Izumi logic, which is foundational to the way that we think in the Conversational School of Philosophy. Since the publication of that work, it has been found that most of its harshest critics have come from Nigeria and Africa, especially because they felt that the way the logic, which is a trivalent system, is structured, bears semblance with Hegel's dialectics. So they are usually quick to dismiss the logic of conversational thinking as the African version of Hegel's dialectics. You can see this is a form of superimposition of Western epistemic paradigms upon indigenous African style thinking, which has eaten deep into contemporary African scholarship. And so this is the thrust of my presentation. I should, however, begin by stating that the minutes allocated to me are not sufficient to treat the entirety of Hegel's dialectics as laid out in his Science of Logic. At the same time, I would not boast I have all the time to talk about the entirety of Izumi's logic. However, I will prune down my discussion to the most important aspects where I think the misconception comes in. So the discussion flow will first of all look at the principal character of Hegel's dialectics. After that, I move on to the nature of the logic of conversational thinking. I would not expand so much on the form, on the latter, because I know when subsequent members of the conversational school begin to talk, they will emphasize more on this. So like I said, I'm just going to tease out the places of divergence between the logic of conversational thinking and Hegel's dialectics. So I think I'll commence with Hegel's dialectics. Excuse me. Hegel, as we all know, is one of the greatest German scholars, and is very popular for his idealism and his laws of dialectics. I should, however, emphasize that when talking about dialectics, Hegel sees a fusion of opposites, where a thesis encounters an antithesis to form a synthesis. One thing to notice in this union is that both the thesis and antithesis, they lose their individual identities in the synthesis. The synthesis then proceeds to form a thesis that encounters another antithesis, and on and on. This is the principal character of Hegel's dialectics. Let me emphasize this point again. In Hegel's dialectics, the thesis comes in contact with an antithesis, and both the thesis and antithesis lose their individual identities in a synthesis, which transforms into a thesis once more, and then which encounters another antithesis, and on and on. Now, this is the main character of Hegel's dialectics. One thing to notice about this is that Hegel's idea is also informed by his idea that everything is a contradiction. And so the contradiction between a thesis and an antithesis will necessarily birth a synthesis. But Hegel is not talking outside the tradition that undergets thought in his era, because the idea of thinking in the mainstream and dominant Western philosophy is guided by the principle of either or and the bivalent system of logic. So in Hegel's system, even when a thesis and antithesis between matter and idea unite, Hegel favors idea over matter. We can see the extension of this in Marx's dialectical materialism and dialectical materialism and historical materialism, where Marx actually shoved Hegel's ideas and replaced it with matter. So the tension between opposites is very, very replete in Western way of thinking. And this also presents itself in dialectics. And this dialectics of opposites presents itself as well in Marx's and Engel's idea as the transformation from quantity to quality and vice versa, the law of negation of the negation, and the clash of opposites or the interpenetration of opposites. So when these opposites interpenetrate, they lose their individual identities. And so what is formed is not solely either of them, but something that births from them. So this is the main character of Hegel's dialectics, which I think I've been able to quickly brush over. Now I'll move to the logic of conversational thinking, which is the Izumi's logic. Izumi's logic is a trivalent system, which means that it's the three-valued logic, where two seemingly opposed variables, seemingly true and seemingly false, they come together to engage themselves in a robust discussion and interaction. This encounter complements. It is a situation or a product where the thought value is both true and false. Both true and false in the sense that each of the discussants or each of the truth values, seemingly true and seemingly false, which are two independent values who are coming together to engage and birth a thought value, do not lose their identities. And so in the process, the central value or the third value, which is the small letter E for Izumi, because Izu and Izu are in Chimakunam's logic stand for similarly true, similarly false propositions, and the Izu, the small letter E now, the small letter E is for the third value, while the capital letter E is for the proper noun for the logic itself. So the small letter E is the third value which symbolizes the products of the encounter between each of these two seemingly opposed variables. And it is also important to emphasize that the trivalent system of logic in conversational thinking is circumspect of the traditional laws of thoughts, which even when Hegel was also circumspect of, he did not make any concrete efforts to improve over them. This is also the case with scholars such as Karl Marx, Engels, Whitehead. So principally, by providing three supplementary laws to support the existing traditional laws, Chimakunam has been able to improve on scholarship regarding logic, because Whitehead is one of those scholars who also believes that, yes, even when we can, in some contexts, admit the traditional laws of thought, in other contexts, these traditional laws of thought do not hold, but they did not make any effort to provide supplementary thoughts. The same case holds with prominent African scholars such as Innocent Asuzu, the late Christy Gioma, and some other African scholars that I cannot mention now. The essence of the discussion is that the traditional laws of thought are not competent to undergird thought in Africa, in African way of thinking. So the essence is that when we are looking at the logic of conversational thinking, we are not looking at the logic where the thought value is subsumed through the identities of each of the independent two values is subsumed in the thought values. No. According to the author, Jonathan Chimakunam, the logic starts as a two-valued logic, but soon graduates into a three-value logic. However, it is also important that he makes efforts to distinguish his three-valued logic from similar efforts in mainstream Western philosophy, because Chimakunam admits that he's not the first person to provide a three-valued logic, and scholars such as Susan Hack, Peter Klein, Jean-Luc Kasevich are scholars that have also been able to provide some of these. But the important thing that is to be noted that distinguishes this logic away from this other three-valued logic is the addition of supplementary laws and the emphasis that the third value is both and false. And so the third value does not, for emphasis, it does not admit the synthesis, because in conversational thinking, a synthesis is an anathema. It is a crime for a synthesis to burst. And so based on this understanding, I think it is important to understand that, to realize that the third value in Izumi's logic, which is a logic of conversational thinking, is not synonymous with the synthesis that presents itself in Hegel's dialectics. I've also been able to show that, to explain that synthesis is an anathema, and that the conversational logic is trivalent and not bivalent. And trivalent in the sense that it has been able to undergird some African ontological theories that were unable to get adequate explanation and elucidation from the Aristotelian bivalent logic that has been used to assess them. And this has created so much misrepresentations and confusions in ways that African ontological theories have been on the intellectual defensive. So based on this combination, I think that I have been able to explain, peeling down to the third value, that the third value in conversational thinking is not synonymous with the synthesis in Hegel's dialectics. I should also end this discussion, this short discussion, by also emphasizing that Izumi's logic, which is the logic of conversational thinking, is not a regional logic. It is not limited to Africa and Africans alone. It is important to understand that this is a logic system that is pliable in places that are not African as well. It is not limited to Africa. You can apply it elsewhere. It is universally applicable, but not absolute, the way the Aristotelian bivalent logic has been emphasized. And based on this, I think it is important I round up by saying that in philosophic discussions, the merest hint of dogmatic sentences as to finality of statement is an exhibition of foolishness. And so it is based on this humble understanding of mine that I present my short talk to you to get feedback from you so that I may know where I have reasoned wrongly. Thank you very much. Dr. Arabia, over to you.
Thank you very much, Emmanuel, for your very brief presentation. It was straight to the point and on time. So if we have any questions for Emmanuel Ofuasia, please raise your hands and then I'll beckon to you to ask your question. So Christiana has a question for you. Christiana, could you briefly ask your question?
Yeah, thank you, Emma, for that presentation. I love how you made it clear. But I wanted to ask, you first of all presented Hegel's dialectics, and then you went now to present Izumi's logic. Would you think that there is a similarity between them? Or would you think that there is a formal, when I mean formal, apart from that it is a logic from a place? Chimakaran would call it logic from an African place. So we can now say that Hegel's dialectics is from the German place, something like that. But apart from this locating the thoughts, do you think that there is a formal difference between these two approaches? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Idika. It's a very wonderful question. I like that, a straightforward question as well. It is important to emphasize once again that there is no similarity between the logic of conversational thinking and Hegel's dialectics regarding the thought value. The two systems actually start with the proposal that there are two opposing variables. However, we should understand that in the mainstream Western way of thinking, the two variables pitched against each other usually end up having one variable superior. Like I mentioned while I was talking, Hegel, in his philosophy of phenomenology of spirits, where he applied his dialectics, brought together idea and matter. But you realize that he favors ideas or spirits over matter. Now, that was why Karl Marx said that Hegel's philosophy is idealistically turned upside down. And so his own aim is to give it a materialistic understanding. And so while Marx favors the materialistic interpretation of one of the variables, Hegel favors the idealistic interpretation of one of the variables. So this is why I think that it is not, it is different from the logic of conversational thinking. Precisely, they are different because the assumption is there from the outset that at the end of the day, only one out of these two, given the law of excluded middle term, only one of these two will triumph. And so the other one loses its identity. But in the logic of conversational thinking, both identities are retained, all right? And that is why I say that in the thought value, it is a case of both can be true and both can be false. It is a complement and not a contradiction. All right, I think I have been able to shed more light on that. Any other question?
Okay, thank you, Emmanuel, for your response. Amara has a question. Amara.
All right.
Thank you very much, Emmanuel, for your presentation. And I just have a simple question. Is Izumi's logic a cultural logic? If yes, do you think logic can be culturalized?
Okay, thank you very much, Amara. Thank you for that question. During the course of my speech, I said Izumi's logic is not a regional logic, although it is an Igbo Africa-inspired system. It's a system that emerged from the realities of the Igbo-speaking people, but also extendable to some other cultures in sub-Saharan Africa. However, the propounder of the logic, Jonathan Chimakuna, is consistent and has vehemently argued that his logic is pliable in places not beyond Africa. And personally, I have done some researches that have been able to show that this logic is also applicable in ontological theories that are beyond Africa, specifically Whitehead's process ontology. And I think with that application, I have been able to show that it does not restrict itself to a particular culture, a particular region of the world, but it's something that is universally applicable as well. Thank you very much, Amara.
Okay, do we have any other hands? Okay, if we have no other hands, let me ask my own question, Emmanuel. Very briefly, could you tell us what you think is the main difference between complementation and synthesis? Because obviously complementation is a huge part of Izumi's logic, just as context is a huge part of Izumi's logic. So, given the nature of complementarity, what do you think differentiates it from synthesis?
Okay. Thank you very much, Dr. Arabia, for that question. I will go straight to the point. Like I said, this is an aspect that I'm sure that some other conversational scholars will amplify over, but I will do that briefly. And I will do that by talking about the two epistemic agents that we usually use in conversational school, the Nwansa and Nwanju, that they enter into a relationship of conversation between one another. And this conversation is undergirded by the inferences of aromaristic and hoacaristic rules. Now, what is to be understood is that the complementation that happens is as a result of the fact that the third value in the system is a conjunction and can also be a disjunction. So this complementation is also suggestive of a creative struggle that happens between these two epistemic agents who are trying to have a conversation about whatever it is that they have. So the conjunction, the conjunctive motion is guided by the hoacaristic inference. And this is why the complementarity or complementation takes place, where there is a conversation between the two of them. This conversation between these two epistemic agents are also guided by the three supplementary laws provided by the logic. And so this is where the idea of complementation comes in, because each of the epistemic agents enter into unity and disunity in the process of exchanging their views. However, in Hegel's synthesis, none of this happens. One of the two variables, or similar of the two, one of them, thesis and antithesis, give birth to a thesis. And in that synthesis, I meant the identity of each of the thesis and antithesis is lost. However, the complementation that makes Izumi's logic more holistic is because the identities of each of the seemingly opposing variables, the Nwanju and Nwansa that enter into a conversation, their identities are retained. And so at the point they can get to the Benoke point, which is an imaginary point where the conversation can reach its climax. And it can also bet a tension of incommensurables, which is the least that can be entertained in that moment of complementarity. Thank you very much, Dr. Arabia. I hope I've been able to answer that question.
Yes, sure. Thank you. I see Nelson Amoabi's hand up. Nelson, can you ask your question very briefly?
At first, I want to apologize for not raising hand earlier. I've been trying to do that. I had some network challenge. However, let me go straight to my question. I have read that book, Ezumezu, and particularly you permit me to cite a particular page and a paragraph, page 94, paragraph 1. It reads, I quote, "Like in every progressive system, these principles referring to the 6 laws shall not be sacrosanct. But like the Western system, these principles shall not be also too strict. One would like to hear the terms dynamic, fluid, flexible, whenever anyone wishes to describe the system, its effect on any new development in it." Now, after laboriously, my question now, after having weaved out a system of logic, which according to Chimakonam, is a prototype of an African logic that would help fill in the gap in those areas in which Aristotelian system of bivalent system seems to fail. Chimakonam seems to have taken it for granted, that's my own thinking, that his idea of logic and the usage of as a coinage of the word Ezumezu as fluid, flexible, amorphous would have a far-reaching ripple effect, which according to Asozu is a boomerang effect. Now, my point is this: why use a coinage that is fluid, weak, pretentious, and hypocritically, that is pretentious, so to speak, to define a system of thought? One that should show worthiness. Also, to say that the principle of Ezumezu is not too strict, like the Western classical logic, means by implication that it is in a sense strict. And as against the Aristotelian system, their strictness and straitjacketedness is a matter of degree. Hence, perspectivism, which inherently is to smuggle the Pythagorean relativist doctrine from the back door, becomes the case. A relativism which Chimakonam had earlier dismissed as an attribute of character that drives the ethno-logicians. This lacuna is, to my mind, what I think makes Ezumezu to fall short of the universalization which it was supposed to bring, and therefore seems to fall into the Waterloo of being a cultural logic. My opinion. Thank you.
All right. Nelson, thank you very much for that interesting question. I know that question is directed at Jonathan Chimakonam, but I want to play an advocacy here. And the first thing I want you to understand is that if you good thing that you have read Izumi's logic, and I'm sure you have encountered the thing that Jonathan discussed in the first chapter of that work, the relationship between knowledge and power, and how indigenous African ideas and systems have been on the intellectual defensive. And so, by using a term that is African, Igbo culturally inspired, he is trying to reject the African voice. Now, you have said that this projection is based on the fact that the word signifies weakness. Personally, I think that if you take it like that, that is your own interpretation of it. Now, my own interpretation of it is that throughout the talk, the book, especially the justification for the introduction of the 3 supplementary laws, the author says that he had to weaken and do some tightening of the traditional laws of thought in order to be able to cope with the inadequacies that they present for ordinary thinking. Now, Chimakunam is not the first person, like I said earlier on, to have made this observation. In the history of Western philosophy, Gottfried Leibniz provided the principle of sufficient reason as a fourth law of thought, but it has not been recognized, actually. Most people do not recognize it. He made that observation. Now, I will give you a very good illustration to show why this weakening is very important, all right? There are cases where you have nitrogen being able to be, according to Whitehead, nitrogen can be acquired from nature via two methods. In one of these methods, the atomic number is slightly higher than the other. Now, according to Whitehead, this presents a contradiction because either one of the methods must be true. Whitehead says that no, at the end of the day, what actually happened was the birth of a new element called argon. Now, that shows that contradiction is not a defeat. It is an opportunity, an invitation to learn and relearn. And so I think that is what Izumi's logic stands for, irrespective of the name and irrespective of how you intend to see it. It is not a logic system that is limited to just the Igbo people. It is not a system that is limited to just Africa. It's a system that is applicable not only for African ontology, but also other ontologies that can birth and apply very well in a trivalent system of logic. I think that is the main thing. Whatever it is, I'm sure the convener himself will be able to sort that out for you personally. I think that's
well, thank you very much. At first, I want to apologize if I sound very confrontational. I had actually written this down some time ago. Thank you very much.
All right.
Thank you, Nelson. Thank you, Nelson. Thank you, Ma, for your response. I'll take one last question from Dr. Sita Najiofo.
Am I seeing any question?
Dr. Sita, if you could
Thank you very much, Emma, for that wonderful presentation. Can you hear me, please?
I can hear you. Please go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much for that wonderful presentation. It's insightful and enlightening. Just a concern, I just want to know, since a civilization rises and fall, I want to know, because of the universalization potential of Izumi's logic, do you have the fear that in future that we will have to contend with the domineering tendency of Izumi's logic as we are presently having with Aristotelian logic, where it will be loaded on everyone to think in that direction? That's my fear, and I want you to talk about it because of the universalization potential which we talked about. Are we in future have to contend with what we are presently contending with Aristotelian logic? I don't know whether you get my question.
Yes. Very good. Thank you very much, Dr. Sita. In the course of Izumizu, the book, Jonathan made a distinction between absolutism and universalism. And it says that it is preferable for an idea to be universal. By this, it meant that it is an idea that it ought to be an idea that should be pliable in China or Germany if it does same in Anambra State, for instance. All right. The fear is that it should not be absolute. It should not present itself as the all-in-all that has the final conclusive statements on logic. In one of the papers I wrote, I have argued as well that in the meantime, Izumi's logic presents itself as a complete system of logic that boasts of a formal system, methodology, and philosophical logic. Previous efforts by African and non-African scholars to articulate a system of logic have not been able to bring these three parts of the system of logic together. And so we are looking forward to other indigenous African scholars go to their indigenous ritual archives, come out with the logic of their own, that perhaps can cover some of the flaws in Izumizu. But personally, I do not see Izumizu presenting itself as an absolute. No, yes, but for universality, yes, it is universally pliable. I think your answer can be answered, your question can be answered by making a dichotomy between what is absolute and what is universal. It might be universal, but not absolute. Yes, Izumizu, yes, but it should not be absolute, even if it has to be universal. That is my own case. Thank you very much, Dr. Sita.
God bless you.
Thank you very much, Ima, for your responses and for your talk. And thank you everyone for contributing and with your questions. I'll now immediately move on to the next speaker. The next speaker is Dr. Joylyn Gwara from the University of Zimbabwe, and she will be talking to us on the topic reason and emotion as binaries in the conceptual analysis of masculinity in African philosophy. So, Dr. Joylyn, you have the floor.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Arabia. I hope you can hear me, and just like he has indicated, my topic is reason and emotion as binaries in the conceptual analysis of masculinity in African philosophy. So in this paper, I challenge the perceived binary between reason and emotion, and the objective being to level the playing ground a little in African philosophy by giving women the opportunity to partake in the discipline, and for the women to also take up this opportunity. So for me, this has to be understood as a two-way process, and I believe it is not enough for women to be given the opportunity to philosophize, but they also need to take up this opportunity. Now, it is the belief of this paper and other like minds, the likes of Chimakonam and Dutoit, Matolino as well, that philosophy has followed African philosophy has followed Western philosophy too closely, especially in its masculine bias. So since Western philosophy was dominated by males, we also see that African philosophy as an intellectual activity followed the Western tradition of bifurcating reality with a bias towards masculinity. So in Anglophone philosophy, there's a tendency to bifurcate reality, and this neatly maps, well, for me, into gender dichotomies. So this bifurcation is between rational or emotional, objective, subjective, mind, body, among others. So in this paper, I consider the bifurcation of reason and emotion. So these two have been gendered such that emotion is to women and reason to men. So women are thus viewed as less rational and more emotional. This has led to men dominating the field of philosophy, which is regarded as a rational enterprise. So this bifurcation of emotion and reason is witnessed in the works of Plato, for instance, who divides the human soul into three parts, and that is the will, the appetites, and reason. And for him, the soul can only be fully human when reason is in control of the appetites and the will. So in his analysis, also for Aristotle, in his analysis of reproduction, he believes that it is semen that contains the full human being, and that in the sexual act, a man is the one who supplies the substance of a human, which is the soul, and the woman supplies the nourishment, which is matter. So this alone serves to demonstrate that women are inferior to men, since they cannot produce semen, which is the life-giving entity. So these views are also found in the later on in the works of Immanuel Kant, who believes that women are incapable of abstract thought. So their faculties of understanding are merely beautiful, not sublime like men's. So that's the idea of a woman philosopher was absurd for Immanuel Kant. So it is my belief that this wide coverage of sexist theorizing in philosophy is made women to shun the discipline. Now, this also has resulted in the perpetual stereotyping of women in philosophy. And here I also quote Aslinger and Mattolino, who agree with the position of this paper that the view that reason and emotion are antithetical is the cause of the marginalization of women in philosophy, thus making the field or the philosophy field a hyper-masculine environment, which is not exactly safe for women. So it is difficult for women to feel at home in environments that are hyper-masculine and are characterized by competitiveness as well as combativeness and thus non-nurturing. So to demonstrate the combativeness of this philosophy, Mattolino narrates his ordeal at his first conference, which was where he presented his project in which he was attacking one of the gurus of African philosophy. And he was later on attacked, or should I say, yes, attacked, and his project was denounced as unphilosophical, worthless, and a waste of everyone's time. And he was even encouraged to abandon an attempt on philosophizing. So based on this experience, Mattolino notes that philosophy is a rigorous, cold-blooded game of pure rationality. And for him, this sort of thing is something expected of males or only appears to be acceptable when done by males. So since African philosophy, as I indicated earlier on, followed in the footsteps of Western philosophy, the marginalization of women in philosophy is not only peculiar to Western circles, but also extends to African women who are also victims of academic marginalization. In African philosophy, women's voices are largely absent. So this absence of women's voices in African philosophy is worrisome, as it were. And I try to look at cases in which we see the absence of women's voices or appreciation of the works of women in African philosophy. For instance, I note that Mattolino also noted as he analyzed the nationalistic ideological orientation in philosophy that were given by Odera Oruka, he believes that this also was predominantly male in nature. And he asserts that for Oruka, what was important in his male-oriented view was that a new class of gladiators had emerged in the African context. And however, what raised Mattolino's curiosity is Oruka's characterization of this trend as one promoted by men alone, ignoring the contribution of women in the Mau Mau in Kenya and in the struggle for independence in Algeria and the Aba women's riot in Nigeria. So further, or in addition to Mattolino's observation, I also invoke Pius Mosima's views, who also notes the underrepresentation of females in African philosophy in Oruka's sage philosophy. And in this, he noted that 12 sages, Oruka interviewed 12 sages, and only one of these sages is a woman. And further to this, he asked, when he was asking his questions, he asked questions to do with the relationship between men and women, only to the male sages, to the exclusion of this question being available to the female sage. Now, also I note that even Mesem Idet notes that in the conventional historiograph of African philosophy, there's also a predominance of masculinity, and it talks about the works that exhibit the periodization of African philosophy is heavily dominated by male, making it a men's discourse or something like that. And then further, he also noted Quasi-Wiredu's Black Companion to African Philosophy is another source that brings out the underrepresentation of women in African philosophy. And in this book, in this companion, we've got a section in which there's history of African philosophy, and with 17 articles of which are authored by men. And for a date, this could be tantamount to historicide. And also, he further notes that of this, the other part of the book, which is 47 articles, only 2 are authored by one female solitary philosopher. And also, Louis Dutoit noted that even Emmanuel Chukwudi, as this African philosophy in anthology, has 51 articles, and of these 51, women authored only 5 essays, in which were specifically raising the questions about philosophy and gender. I further note that the same imbalance. I further also note the same imbalance in the book that Louis Dutoit co-authored, or sorry, co-edited with Chimakonam in 2018, African Philosophy and the Epistemic Marginalization of Women. So much of what the book interrogates are questions which are better off answered from the horse's mouth, that is the women themselves. So for instance, the questions, what is the place of women and women's issues, experiences, and concerns as themes for philosophical deliberation, and what should it be? Apart from the questions of themes, do women currently feature as participants in the philosophical discussion, discipline, canon, institutions, and if not, what are the contributing causes? So I've noted that out of the 14 authors in this volume, only 6 are female. And so the book is also dominated by male theorists who purport to answer questions that have to do with women's experiences. So from this, I believe these male theorists may not be privileged enough to offer answers to questions concerning the experiences and concerns of women in philosophical deliberations, and also the causes of the lack of women contribution in the discipline. However, this is not to take anything away from the book, which I believe is the starting point in engaging women, but this is something that we also need to note. Now, it is against this background of high masculine bias in African philosophy that I call for the leveling of the playground. So women's voices should be encouraged and be listened to as they narrate their own experiences, their day-to-day lived experiences in patriarchal societies, as well as thereby making them to cease to be objects of knowledge. So I therefore call for the creation of an environment which encourages the inclusion of women in the academic field of philosophy in African circles. And this core is based on my view that the binary between reason and emotion, male and female in Anglophone philosophy, is a misconception when we analyze it in African culture. So in African societies, roles are assigned based on gender. In other words, there are things that men can do that women cannot do. And also there are things that women can do that men cannot do. Better still, there are also things that men and women can do together. So in these societies, there is no talk of superiority or inferiority in human relations. Instead, male and females are understood as complementing each other. So following this belief, I consider the male bias in African academic circles is missing links, which ought to be unified by bringing in female voices on board. So given this argument, it implies that men are not the only possessors of reason, neither are females the only possessors of emotion. Therefore, given that women are rational, they can partake in philosophy and in particular, African philosophy. So women should take the opportunity offered and participate effectively in the field of African philosophy as well as its development. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Joylene, for your talk. Wonderful talk. If you have any questions for Dr. Joylene, please raise your hands. I see Dr. Maduka has raised his hands immediately. So Dr. Maduka, please ask your question.
Yeah, Dr. Joylene, thank you for your presentation. Quite interesting. I am worried with your thoughts that African philosophy in gender bias. So that prompts me to ask this question. Is it a question of the male philosophers preventing women from philosophizing or being philosophers? Or is it a question of the female folks refusing to take up the challenge of philosophizing, which you have just called them now, as you are trying to end, you are calling on women to take up the challenge? Is it not the fact that women are not taking up the challenge? Not that we are, not that the men folks are marginalizing them intellectually in that guise. Thank you. That's my question.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Maduka. Well, first of all, I will respond by saying I think it's both ways. Like I indicated from the onset, that African philosophy is following in the footsteps of Western philosophy. So for me, I believe there was that time when women were not given this opportunity to philosophize. And even when that opportunity is given, women still shun this the field, as it were. So this is why I have called upon the males to give women opportunity, as well as for the females to also take up this opportunity. I hope I have answered you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. I see another hand from Dr. Christina Idika. Dr. Christina, please, your question. Very briefly.
Okay, Joylene, thank you so much for that discussion. I mean, reason and emotion is something I have kept myself busy since I wrote my doctorate. There are 2 points you made. First, you talked about leveling of playground. Now, how do you interpret this leveling of playground? Are you talking about sympathy or allocation of positions? So giving space, because I would want a woman to be recognized and to be placed there because she merited it, not just because she's a woman. So when we say we should give them space to participate, what would you mean by that? Second point, have you ever considered to look at the question of this binary bias from the perspective of the fundamental question of what is a woman? So we can now, we are able to look at already the anthropological framework of how this thing exists. Then the final question is following Chimakonam's Izumi's logic as complementary. The last time he made a presentation, he presented that female-male dichotomy. But some people claim that the human brain works in categories. okay, in order to make selections and place things in categories. How will Chimakonam's Izume's logic of complementarity reconcile this claim that the human mind, categorize things? Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Christina. So your first question, which had to do with the space, and what I believe is that I'm not saying we should be awarded without merit, but my point is, if you've looked at or if you've listened to my presentation, I've highlighted quite a number of books. Well, in particular, the one that I'm interested in is the last one edited by Jonathan and Louis. And the fundamental questions that are in these books, and I believe these are questions that are better off answered by females, like what is the cause of the lack of participation of women in philosophy? For me, this is the question that is best suited, answered by the female philosophers themselves. But if you look at the volume itself, it is dominated by the males who are attempting to answer this question from outside looking inside. I don't know if you get what I mean. So my point is, why not give the women themselves the platform? This is the leveling of the ground that I'm talking about. It is women that should speak about their own experiences, because they are the ones who are living in these experiences. So yeah, basically that's what I mean by leveling the ground, allowing the women to speak, not for others, to speak on behalf of them. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I see some other hands. Please, to allow everybody fair chance to ask their questions, let us be very brief and straight to the point with our questions. So, Amal B. Nelson, you ask your question, followed by Emmanuel of Wasia. So, Nelson, your question, please.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, Doctor, I really appreciate you for this talk. It has really led it to a number of debates. But however, I have some questions which I would like you to reflect on. Well, just still tied to most of the questions that have been asked earlier. Now, presently, from my understanding, the issue about the marginalization of women as it regards epistemology or philosophy, as the case may be, has gone beyond, the gender bifurcation between the male and the female. Today, we have those we call the transgender, and so many other categories of individuals who are beginning to assume some different sexual orientations. So I'm asking, what do you think don't you think that the argument now has gone beyond the fact of whether a male philosophers and female philosophers? So what is now, it could lead to, a damaging, or shall I say, I may have lost the word for it, but I'm trying to conceive a situation in which we have different sexual orientations, people come and propose arguments about being marginalized, and raising different ideas about marginalization in terms of epistemology. And also, in the same vein, I think the question is not about the male philosophers or the female philosophers. The question is about what is the originality of thought that is coming out from the male, so to speak, or the female. So talking about giving females opportunity to philosophize, to raise ideas. The likes of Schopenhauer was a philosopher. He was a male, but he wrote, most of his writings were emotional.
Please be brief.
Yeah. So my question, however, is, don't you think that this campaign, for including female philosophers, giving them opportunity to philosophize. I don't think anybody is holding them, just like the previous questionnaire has noted. I don't think anybody is holding them. So I think it's all about being able to produce original ideas. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much for that. Should I take it as a contribution or a question? If I take it as a question, then I would probably answer the part that no one is holding them back. But if you've noticed, I've argued from the onset that the theorizing and the nature of the theorizing of the discipline itself, theorizing of philosophy itself is highly sexist in nature. And also that alone is probably led other women to shun the discipline itself. Imagine yourself as a woman getting to your first lecture on probably Aristotle, and you're being told that a female is a castrated male. This is something that can actually make you the discipline not so much appealing as it were. And yeah, for me, personally, there's no one that is really holding them back, but except that the environment itself, which I've also highlighted, citing Matolino's ordeal, that it is combative in nature, and this is unlike women, as it were. As women, we are not combative; we are nurturing in our nature. And so that alone can actually make females not really be interested in engaging in philosophy, which is viewed as which is combative in nature. I hope I have answered that one.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Joylene. Thank you, Nelson, for your question. Emmanuel of Wasia, please, very brief question and very brief response to.
Yes, I'll be very brief. Thank you very much, Dr. Joylene. I first of all want to ask, because you cited a work that Jonathan edited with somebody in 2018, and you said that when you flip through the content, you found out that most of the contributors are actually male. And you are decrying that most females, maybe they were left out. But the question I want to ask is, when a call for paper is given, it is the business of the women themselves to participate. So if the editor finds that most men are submitting abstracts, will he or she decide to drop those abstracts because women are not participating? That's the question I ask concerning that. Then the second question is concerning your admission that African philosophy is following the footsteps of Western philosophy concerning gender marginalization. I think that is not true. In the history of Western philosophy, there's a particular female philosopher called Hypatia. Hypatia was hacked to death in Alexandria, Egypt by some monks because she was practicing philosophy. I've never seen any African philosopher hacked to death by fellow male philosophers in Africa. So I think you need to actually expatiate on what you mean by we are following the footsteps of Western philosophy concerning gender marginalization. The third issue has to do with the fact that many things are holding women down. All right. The motherhood. This is a fact that scholars like Simone de Beauvoir, like Julien Kristeva, they say that the whole process of menstruation, gestation, these are things that hold women down from actually functioning well. The other day, Amara Esther was giving us a presentation here, Emmanuel, and we can see how she was struggling. I'm done. You can see how she was struggling with her baby, trying to pass her views along. So these are things that women go through that actually hold them down from functioning optimally. Thank you very much, Arabia and Dr. Joylene. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Emmanuel. First of all, I will indicate that the reason why I've cited the recent publication in African philosophy by edited by Jonathan Chimakonam and Louis Dutoit is that I had also noticed that Louis actually laments the same thing concerning Eze's anthology to African philosophy, and she actually denounce this as well, the highly male part of the authorship of the volume, as it were. And so for me, I found it quite interesting that even Louis, being part of the editorial team, would also allow a project that she's part of to be also dominated by males. That's why I've brought this up. The other question was on African philosophy following heavily in the footsteps of Western philosophy. To that, I think, yeah, well, I may agree. I may not really agree with you. I would beg to differ that I believe, and I strongly believe, that this is the direction that we are taking. And I've indicated so many cases that can actually prove, from Odera Oruka's sage philosophy to Odera Oruka's to the historiograph that were given by a date to indicate that this is the direction that we are taking. And then the other thing about women, you cited about Amara trying to, take care of the baby at the same time. Yes, exactly. That is my point. That this is the reason why I'm calling for women to be the ones that are speaking about their experiences. Because you may as males, you can just talk about it from outside. But if you ask us, what is it that is stopping you from being part of this discipline? That mothering aspect can actually come out, but you wouldn't hear that from male philosophers because they do not experience these things in their day-to-day lives. That's my thinking. I hope I've answered you.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Joylene. Bjorn, you're next. Could you very briefly ask your question, and then Joylene can very briefly respond.
Yes, thank you very much. Yeah, I just wanted to make two comments. So the first thing is, I don't think that it is simply up for the women to participate in a call for papers. It could mean, if a call for papers is not only answered by answered by men or predominantly by men, it could mean that women do not have interest, but it could also mean that systemic oppression is successful. I mean, we have a lot of examples for cases where specific people, specific groups, genders, whatever it is, do not participate in certain things. But to say that it is because these women do not want is to make them responsible for their systemic oppression. And I don't think that that is what we should do. That's the one thing. And the other thing that I thought of after this beautiful presentation is, again, it is a myth that men are thinking predominantly rational. If you go through the canon of the Western philosophical history, you will find a lot of works that are absolutely not merely rational thought. You find it in Plato, to Augustine, to Thomas. You find it literally everywhere, that this distinction, that this idea of what a man is in itself a male fabrication. And from my point of view, there's not so much that we can do about that to overcome that myth, but to finally learn to listen that there's a difference between a male voice and a human voice per se, which in my understanding does not exist. And I really think that this approach to the female voice can teach us to learn that just being representative of your very own group, whatever it is, be it in this case a specific gender, can learn to fully embrace what it means, not only to be a woman, but also what it means to be a man. Because I think there is as much misconceptions about manlyhood as there are about womanhood. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you so much for that contribution. Well, I'll take it as a contribution.
I think, yeah, it was a very brilliant contribution by Bjorn. Amara has a question. Please, very briefly.
Okay, thank you very much for your presentation. Mine is not actually a question, but a contribution. I feel that the starting point to question gender binary in African philosophy is to question the underlying logic grounding African philosophy, which is the Aristotelian logic. Because if this logic is not questioned, I believe that your
I think we lost Amara there for a while. While she comes back, can Yvette Freta ask a question while Amara gets her network back?
Thank you so much. Really, I just wanted to comment and applaud you for your contribution. I think as women, we are dealing with a lot of gatekeeping, whether it's being accepted in journals, conferences, and the additional challenges we face, giving childbearing, and the other kinds of things like that. I think you're speaking to the idea of these
Yvette, I think, I don't know if I'm the only one hearing this, but I think your audio is pretty bad.
Yeah, it is.
Sorry. Okay.
Okay, let Diana ask a question, then we will return back to Amara and then to Yvette again. Diana, your question, please.
Thank you very much, Dr. Arabia. Mine is not actually a question. Like Amara was saying before the network interrupted her. I think first it starts with the question of the logic underlying African philosophy, or the logic that is being used in the theorizing or conceptualizing of this understanding of understanding in African philosophy. And I think if we start from interrogating this logic, then it will give us like to give women the space to actually talk about their experiences themselves. And again, I think Emmanuel oversimplified what it means to be a woman and a woman who is doing philosophy. Like I'm just contributing to what Joylene already explained. I think the nuances surrounding gender bifurcation and gender binary is far more complicated than the way you see it or the way you understand it. So it's not just all about something. It's not all about sending out your abstract to be published and all. I think it is something we really need to interrogate, and in doing this, we should rather just come together, have a conversation about it, as in a deep-seated conversation on the way forward. I think I'll just have to stop here. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you, Diana, for that contribution. I'll take note of it.
All right, thank you, Diana, for your comments. Please, Amara, if you're back, could you ask your question? I think Amara is still having difficulties. Yvette, let's see if your audio is better now.
Now, can you hear me?
It's still terrible. Perhaps you can send your question to the chat box, and then Dr. Joylene can respond to you later on. Let's please move on. Dr. Lucky.
Thank you, Dr. Arabia.
Hello.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, I'm presenting on applying conversational thinking on the problem of xenophobia in multicultural society. My topic is a topic that has two central concepts. One of these concepts is xenophobia, and the other is conversational thinking. And a lot of works have been written on the subject of xenophobia, but to the best of my knowledge, I'm yet to see a work that is centered on applying conversational thinking on this subject. Also, a lot of scholars have written on conversational thinking, especially African philosophers, mostly of the conversational school of philosophy, but none of them have been able to come into addressing the question of xenophobia using conversational thinking. Hence, my aim in this work is to fill this lacuna by looking at how conversational thinking can be employed to address the concept of xenophobia, and in particular in multicultural societies. I'll first of all look at what xenophobia is in a multicultural society. And in multicultural societies, you can talk about multicultural societies where you have a cultural diversity or cultural plurality, wherein people of different cultures coexist and intermingle. But the problem that we can find in such societies is that there is that lack of actual integration of these people of different cultures. Hence, the division of the society into two sections. Those at the center and those at the peripheries. Those at the center are always those who tend to exhibit a xenophobic tendency, while those at the peripheries are those who are at the receiving end of this xenophobic act. Hence, the need to understand that multicultural societies are societies where xenophobic tendencies and xenophobic actions are present. And what is xenophobia? Xenophobia is the fear, hatred, and discrimination against strangers. And if we say that multicultural society is a society of cultural diversity, it implies that there are lots of cultures coexisting in such societies. Hence, we can talk about linguistic background, people from different linguistic background, people from different religious background, people from different ethnic background, people from different racial background, people from different national background coexisting together within the society. But because of the bifurcated nature of this society, we therefore have this tendency to discriminate against a particular group of people or some group of persons based on their cultural background, hence the different forms of xenophobia. One of it is a linguistic xenophobia. Linguistic xenophobia has to do with discrimination of people based on their language. And there is also the religious xenophobia, which has to do with the discrimination of people based on religious differences. And we can see it in the way those of the Islamic faith are treated in the US and some countries in Europe. They see them as people who have the tendency to get involved in terrorism, and therefore they are seen as those who shouldn't be integrated into the society.
Dr. Lucky, please, can I ask you to please expand your PowerPoint slides? Thank you. Sorry for the interruption.
Well, it will come on. I don't know, it's like I'm having network issues here.
No, Dr. Lucky, click on the small box above the one you clicked on. Close the link, close it, and click on the small box above the one you clicked on.
I'm coming.
You still have to share your document.
Yeah, that's what I'm doing.
Okay, can you see something below that looks like a lamp holder? Yeah, go down below, click on it. No, yes, that one.
Okay.
Good. All right. Thank you.
Yes. The religious xenophobia is what most of the Muslims suffered, as I mentioned. And that is why it is called Islamophobia, because those of the Islamic faith are discriminated against in some countries. And then we have the racial xenophobia. Racial xenophobia is the discrimination against people based on their race. And this one also tinkled down into what we call Afrophobia, the fear and discriminations against those of African origin. And there is also the Negrophobia, which is the fear and discrimination against those of the dark skin. And we also have the national phobia, like the one taking place in South Africa, where those of different nationalities are being discriminated against because they are seen as strangers that must not be accepted or integrated into the society. And the argument of most of those who perpetrate xenophobia is that those so-called strangers are those who are responsible for criminal activities, terrorism, and economic decline in their host community. The central thought when it comes to xenophobia in a multi-ethnic society or multicultural society is that there is the bifurcation of the society into two groups, just like in the idea of the self and the other. But here, the two groups are the indigenous and the foreigners, wherein those who are on the majority see themselves as the indigenous and they see others who are the minority as the strangers who should not be accepted into the society. Hence, the need for a philosophical system that can help us overcome this bifurcated tendency and bring people together to work as a team. And that's why I'm looking at conversational thinking. And here I'm going to look at some of the key points or the key ideas in conversational thinking. I would like to start by saying that conversational thinking is a philosophical system that is propagated by Jonathan Chimakonam, and that this philosophical system has been accepted by members of the conversational philosophy as their own system, as can be found in the works of these members, such as Victor Nweke, Mesembe Eded, Maduka Enyimba, Jonathan Chimakonam, and Obunaya Loki. The central point to note is that conversational thinking is made up of two concepts. One is thinking and the other is conversation, is conversational. The word thinking means to reflect or to have thought about something, but this is just an ordinary meaning. Chimakonam and the members of the Conversational School of Philosophy
have been able to look at this concept from the philosophical angles. Hence, for Chimakana, he conceptualizes it as asking and answering philosophical questions. So when one begins to question, to ask questions and answer those questions, the person is engaged in reflection on a particular subject matter, and that is philosophical thinking. The other word is conversational, which is an adjectival form of the noun conversation, which means to engage in an exchange of thought or ideas. But if you look at it, you come to realize that conversation goes beyond just mere exchange of thoughts or ideas, because if it is an exchange of thought or ideas, then we'll accept with Jonathan, with the view of Enyimba Maduka, that it is derived from the Igbo word mparitoka or nkoritoka. But for the conversationalist, it is not just derived from mparitoka or nkoritoka. Well, it is derived from arumaroka. The word arumaroka has to do with doubting the position that has been asserted by someone else on a particular subject matter during a discussion. So in conversing, a particular person tried to doubt the position posited such that he or she restructures that position to become another position that could also be engaged in. Hence, we can say that arumaroka is foundational to conversational thinking. The second point to note is that conversational thinking is anchored on the sub-Saharan notion of relationship. But this brings the problem of thinking of a relationship as an idea that is found only within the sub-Saharan Africa. That's not true. Chimakonam has argued that other non-African cultures have this notion of relationship, but he chose to pick out this as an African notion because it emphasizes the idea of communion and coexistence and interconnectedness and relating with one another within a given society. The point to note here is that arumaroka as conversation cannot take place unless where there is a relationship between the two conversants. Another point to note is that conversational thinking is both a method and a philosophy. A method of conversational philosophy is known as conversationalism. And what is conversationalism? As I stated earlier, that the word conversation as employed by the conversationalist has to do with the Igbo word arumaroka, which means to doubt, which means to engage the other's view or position posited. Hence, conversationalism has to do with aromaristic relationship that exists between two epistemic agents. And these two epistemic agents, according to the conversationalist, are the Nwa, Nsa, and Nwanjo. Nwansa has to do with the proponent of an idea, one who put forward an idea, while Nwanjo has to do with one who questions this idea. The person does not just question this idea, but he questions this idea in such a manner that he generates and finds fault in this idea without just leaving it at that point, but going beyond to posit or restructure this position to reflect his own position. And this continues endlessly. Hence, conversationalism as a method of conversational thinking is a continuous, ceaseless, critical and creative engagement that ensues between two epistemic agents, Nwansa and Nwanjo, such that new concepts, new ideas, and new thoughts are being generated. When one begins to use this method of conversational thinking to do philosophy. Such a scholar is said to be involved in conversational philosophy. Conversational philosophy is the philosophy of conversational thinking, and it has to do with employing the method of conversationalism to do philosophy, as I've stated. And in doing this, what the epistemic agents do is that they try to address human existential problems through critical and creative engagement. That is to say, they get engaged in an aromaristic relationship, wherein in this relationship, they propose ideas that are engaged and further engaged such that new thoughts are brought out about the idea that they try to discuss or the problem they try to solve. Hence, Chimakonam notes that conversational philosophy is a strictly formal intellectual engagement between or among proponents called Nwansa and opponent called Nwanjo, who engage in an aromaristic on a specific thought in which critical and rigorous questioning and answers are employed to creatively unveil new concepts and open up new vistas of thought, end of quote. What can be deduced here is that conversational thinking and conversational philosophy in particular involves critical and creative engaging of human existential challenges on or philosophical issues by Nwansa and Nwanju in order to propose possible solutions which can further be engaged on by other scholars as time changes. The central point to note here is that in conversational thinking, there are two epistemic or ontological agents, one, Nwansa, and two, Nwanjo. And there is also Nwanzube, which is the meeting point between Nwansa and Nwanjo. And this meeting point between Nwansa and Nwanjo, which is known as Nwanzube, is where Mmeko takes place. And what is Mmeko? For Jonathan Chimakona, Mmeko means complementarity, and it can further be interpreted to imply solidarity. Hence, in conversational thinking, Nwansa and Nwanjo get involved in Mmeko within Nwanzube. This idea implies that there is a tendency for Nwansa and Nwanjo to always work in complementarity and solidarity. Therefore, it promotes the idea of togetherness. It is with this that we can say that conversational thinking has implication for addressing the problem of xenophobia in multicultural societies. If you look at the word Nwanzube being a meeting point between Nwansa and Nwanjo, we can say that there is a meeting point within a xenophobic society or multicultural society wherein two entities relate, and that is the multicultural society. So Nwanzube can be equated to the multicultural society, and Nwansa can be seen as the indigenous, while Nwanjo can also be taken as the strangers, as Mmeko is already noted to imply complementarity and solidarity. If you look at the multicultural society where there is xenophobia, there is that tendency for Nwansa to say, no, I won't work together with Nwanjo. That is to say that the stranger will say, I can't work together. And the indigenous can say that I can't work together with the strangers because they are not part of our society. Hence, there's that idea of discrimination which depicts xenophobia. But what conversational thinking is enjoining us to learn is that there is that idea of togetherness within Nwanzube, which here is taken to be a multicultural society, wherein both the indigenes and the strangers can see themselves as opposites that can come together and complementarily contribute towards the development of the society. Hence, my argument in this work is that conversational thinking has that tendency to promote the idea of togetherness, wherein opposites can coexist and work complementarily and in solidarity with one another to see that a particular problem is addressed. Hence, within a multicultural society, we shouldn't look at our religious differences, our racial differences, our ethnic differences, our national differences. We should look at what we can contribute collectively to the development of the society. Thank you. Hello.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lucky, for your talk. This is time for questions. If you have any questions, please raise your hands. While we are waiting for hands to be raised, I have a question for Dr. Lucky.
Okay.
Yes, it is true that proponents and opponents, once and one Jew, may not want to come into conversation, and then that creates a problem because there won't be any conversation. For instance, in this context between foreigners and their host communities. But what if there is a situation where the conversations they have are mainly or only disjunctive rather than conjunctive? So what if it is only sort of, for instance, in the conversational graph, there is complementation and contextualization. So what if the discussion is only based on context and never based on complementation? How do we move beyond that disjunctive mode to the conjunctive mode? And what if participants in this conversation refuse to move towards the conjunctive mode? What next?
Okay, if I get your question right, and I believe that you're coming from a logical ambience. Yeah, if we go back to thinking about conversationalism from the angle of logic, we'll come to realize that logic is what underguides human relation. And in discussing conversational thinking, we cannot do away with logic. And the idea of xenophobia in a multicultural society is predicated on relationship. And it is predicated on disjunctive relationship, wherein the indigenes want to live without the strangers. With this, we see that there's the working of bivalent logic, the either this or that logic. And with this kind of logic, it becomes difficult for the indigenes to allow the integration of strangers into their society because their mind is working in such a way that they think of either themselves or the stranger. Hence, there is that bifurcation. But it is our call within the conversational tradition that the indigenes should begin to think with the trivalent logic system, wherein while you're thinking it is either this or that, either the self or the other, you're also thinking of the possibility of the self existing with the other, and not just existing with the other, but integrating itself with the other, or integrating the self with itself, and therefore, integrating the other with itself, and therefore, complementarily coexisting such that they can work together. It's a conscious thing. And there is one canon of the conversational school of philosophy I like to allude to, which is the canon of transformative indigenization. Here, this canon can help us to think of how to bring those who are not originally indigenes of a particular place to participate in developing that place. Not necessarily that they must become an indigene, but they are integrated through the contextual need of the society. So it's a conscious effort that we are enjoining the indigent to imbibe and also practice the idea of coexistence, learning to allow others complement their deficiency and they also complement the deficiency of others, as well as living in solidarity to solve their existential problem. Thank you.
Thank you for your response, Dr. Lucky. I see a hand raised by Chukwemeka Ugosi. Chukwemeka, you can ask your question, but please be brief, very brief and straight to the point.
Okay, thank you, Arabia, for giving me that opportunity. Thank you, Dr. Lucky, for that wonderful presentation. My question will be on your conceptual analysis. You rightly defined xenophobia as a fear against strangers. So I want to ask, going by your conceptual definition of xenophobia, is Islamophobia and Afrophobia the same thing as xenophobia? That is my question number one. And then question number two, Aristotle once said that poverty is the parent of revolution and crime, and you identified crime as one of the causes of xenophobia. So I want to ask, how can your conversationalism as a method which you employed in your presentation solve the problem of poverty? And finally, is every revolution or is every agitation or every disagreement or every attack on an individual xenophobic? Thank you.
Okay, let me start with your last question. Every attack on an individual is not xenophobic. But when it's an attack, they are seen as seeing the other individual as an outsider or a stranger, it is xenophobic. Then Islamophobia, as I stated, is an aspect of religious xenophobia. And here in Islamophobia, those who belong to the Islamic faith are being discriminated against, so it is xenophobic. Also Afrophobia, wherein Africans are being discriminated against, is also xenophobic. Then with your question, although I didn't take this question into consideration when reflecting on my topic, but I'm going to take it into consideration. But you should note that the idea I'm trying to push forward here is that yes, poverty leads to crime. I don't deny that. But if we live in complementarity with each other, there is a possibility of us living also in solidarity, wherein we can help each other. And when we do that, we can overcome the problem of poverty as people would contribute towards the well-being of each other in solidarity. And therefore, it will lead also to the reduction in crime. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lucky. I'll just take two more questions before we go. Amara first, and then Nelson next. Amara, your question.
Thank you, Dr. Lucky, for your presentation. My question is on religious xenophobia. You know, in Africa, particularly in the northern part of Nigeria, there have been religious conflicts, you know, fueled by the religious of Islam and Christianity. My question is that, do you think there will ever be a meaningful conversation between the practitioners of these religions? And if yes, how can we achieve it? Thank you.
Well, thank you. Yeah, we really understand the problem in Nigeria as much more of those of the Islamic faith attacking those of the Christian faith. And these religious differences that exist in that area can be overcome, but it requires members of both faiths to see themselves as complementary opposites rather than binary opposites. The present challenge is that they are seeing themselves as binary opposites. For the Muslim, everyone must become a Christian. This is like trying to propose what Izumi calls consumptive monism, where everybody must become a particular entity or a particular reality. Here, everybody must become a Muslim in order for the person to become a Nigerian. But in conversational thinking, we advocate binary complementarity, wherein everybody can exist within his or her own religious faith and relate well with the other. So our call is to see the other as having something to offer, as an integral part of the self. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lucky, for your response. Nelson, could you quickly ask your question very briefly?
Thank you very much. I'll just go straight to the points. Dr. Lucky, thank you for your presentation. I just wish to ask, when you are making your analysis of those who are involved in conversation, you mentioned the Nwansa and the Nwanju as the two interlocutors. Now, I want to ask, let's assume that the Nwansa is coming from a mindset that is predominantly a two-valued logic, and that of the Nwanju coming from another mindset that is predominated by a three-valued logic. At what point do they collapse into a conversation? Because for them to collapse, of course, they have to agree, they have to disagree to agree. Or in other words, the first person, the Nwansa, is coming from a predominated two-valued logic. That of the Nwanju is coming from a predominated three-valued logic. So, and these are logics that have informed their bets, informed their experiences over time. So how do you think conversational thinking can be able to address such situation in a bid to further, address the problem of xenophobia when these two interlocutors are coming from different background logic? That's my question.
Okay, thank you for the question. Yes, the problem is a logical one, as I stated earlier while responding to the first question. It's a logical problem because two distinct logic here operate, as you pointed out. One is a two-value logic, and the other is three-value logic. Yes, if Nwansa is coming with two-value logic, and as I pointed out during my presentation, I see Nwansa as the indigene who does not want the stranger to participate in the same society with him or her. That is the problem of bivalent logic, either this or that. And naturally, every stranger who wants to delve into another land is going with three-value logic, a logic that allows him to coexist with the other. What I am advocating here is that we need to teach Nwansa to learn three-value logic. Not only learn it, imbibe it and put it into practice. It is in this way that he can accept Nwanju as an integral part of Nwanzube, where both of them can live in complementarity and solidarity. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lucky. Unfortunately, we need to end it here because we need to go into a break so we can quickly start our next session. I see Tosin Adiete has his hand up, but I would implore Tosin to please ask his question on the chat box, and then Dr. Lucky can respond to him or to his question on the chat box. The next session is our break section. I'm sure we've had a wonderful conversation this morning session. After the break session, we would start the afternoon session, And the moderators for the afternoon session is Dr. Mosima and Dr. Oyekan Adiolu. They'll be the moderators. The break session would end at 11:30 Nigerian time or 12:30. Sorry, let me confirm. Yes, the break time would end 11:30 Nigerian time or 12:30 South African time or 10:30 I think GMT, or we are still in BST. If it's BST, then it's still 11:30 British time. So let's take the opportunity to stretch our legs, to relax, and then we will reconvene at 11:30 Nigerian time or 12:30 South African time to continue the conversation. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Yeah, break time. Anụmanụ m ji ekpọsị m na ọ na-abịa. Just terrible.